Saturday. After a hectic week, Lynn finally had 2 whole days to himself. Morning sunlight filtered through the gaps in the curtains, scattering golden patches across the floor where dust motes drifted lazily. A proper weekend to him meant one essential thing: sleeping in. With no classes to drag him out of bed, Lynn slept until noon. He'd even told Edgar and the others the night before that no one was allowed to wake him today. If the sky fell, it could wait until he woke. When Edgar had asked, "What if the castle catches fire?" Lynn hadn't opened his eyes. He just rolled over and muttered, "As long as it doesn't reach me, it can burn." He lay sprawled across the bed, quilt kicked aside, pillow askew, hair a mess, breathing slow and even. Then the dormitory door slammed open with a bang. The sound exploded through the quiet room. Lynn shot upright, hair even wilder. His eyes were only half open. His face registered somewhere between what's happening and who on earth dares. He blinked as his vision focused on Edgar, who had just come in. Edgar stood in the doorway, chest heaving, face flushed, fists clenched. "What happened? What's got you so worked up?" Lynn rubbed his eyes, voice rough from sleep, and pushed a pillow behind his back. Edgar scratched his head and, having rehearsed what to say and then tossed it aside, finally burst out, "That pink toad is going too far." Lynn stared, taking a couple of seconds to place the insult. Then he looked at William, who'd been with Edgar, eyes asking for an explanation. William sighed and told the story as calmly as he could. "We went to the dueling club this morning." Lynn nodded. He'd been a few times, but had gotten bored. Fighting people wasn't nearly as fun as fighting fish, so he'd stopped going regularly. Edgar and the others, though, kept at it. Edgar was there every Saturday, claiming he had to stay in shape. "You have to practice," he'd say. "Professor Moody said dark wizards won't wait for you to memorize your incantations." "We were practicing fine," William went on. "Everyone was on the grounds doing their own thing. Professor Flitwick was there too. He taught a few defensive techniques today, and everyone was taking it seriously." Lynn kept nodding, and William continued. Then Umbridge arrived. She had a piece of parchment, walked into the club, stood in the middle of the grounds, and said she had an announcement about regulations. Professor Flitwick asked what regulations she meant, but she ignored him and told everyone to stop and listen. Edgar snorted with barely concealed rage. William went on. "She said the club seriously threatened student safety and announced the closure of the dueling club. From today on, any unauthorized spell confrontations between students are strictly forbidden." "Educational Decree Number 22 from the Ministry," William added when Lynn asked. She read it out. The gist was that the Ministry has the right to supervise extracurricular activities at Hogwarts, and any activity that could endanger student safety must be approved by the Ministry. Since the dueling club hasn't been approved, it must be shut down. "That's horse crap," Edgar exploded. "It's enough that her defense against the dark arts class is useless. She just makes us read the textbook. 2 whole lessons of reading, not a single spell taught. And now we can't even practice privately? By what right?" He grew more animated as he spoke, turning redder and pacing. Suddenly, he pulled a phone from his pocket. "I'm calling my dad," he snarled. "I'll have him impeach that Umbridge." Lynn's eyelid twitched. He grabbed Edgar's hand as the boy reached for the device. "What for?" Lynn let go and flopped back against the headboard, regarding Edgar like an idiot. "Do you want your dad to lose his job? There's a 2-rank difference." Edgar blinked, confused. 2-rank difference. Lynn, a little stunned himself, asked, "Isn't your father the director of the International Magical Law Office?" "If your father is an office director trying to impeach a senior undersecretary at the ministry, that's not a good look." Edgar's expression shifted from bewilderment to sheepish pride. "That was before," he said. "My dad got promoted. To head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation," Lynn said, eyebrows arching. Edgar enunciated the head as if to make sure Lynn heard. Lynn's eyes widened. "He moved up that fast?" "A department head in the ministry isn't a small post. Wasn't the previous head Arthur a Death Eater?" Edgar lowered his voice out of discomfort. "After you dealt with him, the position was vacant for a while. My dad was chosen because of his reputation." Lynn was silent for a second, then got out of bed and dressed without a word. "Fine. You go file your complaint. I'm going fishing." He grabbed his fishing rod from the corner and left the dormitory, grumbling something about worrying over things that weren't his problem. Back at the Black Lake after a long absence, Lynn felt unusually pleased. Sunlight danced on the water like scattered gold. He stood on his favorite rock, looking over the lake that had been his fishing ground for 4 years. 4 years. He'd gone from a novice who never caught anything to, well, still someone who rarely caught anything, but more skilled for it. The important thing was what he'd learned. The fish in this lake didn't respond to stationary fishing. Sitting on a little stool with a float had yielded nothing for 4 years, so he'd switched to lure fishing, the kind where you cast a lure and retrieve it so the bait mimics a struggling fish to tempt the big ones. It was a skill-based method, reading currents, judging fish behavior, controlling the lure. It also demanded strength, something Lynn had plenty of. He admired his heavy-duty rod. It had been custom-made over the holidays. The body was walnut-reinforced with a carbon fiber composite, light, strong, and incredibly flexible. The guides were plated with mithril, so the line ran smoothly. The reel seat was wrapped in leather for a perfect grip. The reel itself had been modified with a little alchemical hum that Lynn liked when he reeled. He clipped on the lure, checked his knots, and stood with his feet braced. Activating 1,000 refinements, he felt like he could cast all the way to the forbidden forest. He drew the rod back until it bowed into a beautiful arc. Then, with a twist of his waist, he let the line fly. The lure traced a perfect parabola through the air, sailed past the shallow weeds and into the deep water he rarely reached. A small ripple marked its fall into the lake. Lynn smiled. Far enough, clean cast. He began to retrieve slowly, feeling the rod tip twitch and the line make tiny ripples. Just as he was savoring the rhythm, a voice exploded behind him. "What are you doing?" Lynn's hand froze on the rod. "Who gave you permission to fish here?" The steps came closer, quick, nervous taps on the stones. He finished the last few turns of the reel and turned. Professor Umbridge stood there, chin lifted, eyes wide with the "you are in serious trouble" look. "Fishing," Lynn said, impatient. "I can see that," she snapped. "I asked, who allowed you to fish here?" "No one allowed it," he replied. "Hogwarts has no rule against fishing." Umbridge's eyes narrowed. She stepped forward. "Mr. Lynn, I believe you have seen the educational decree posted on the notice board." She held herself very straight. "The Ministry of Magic has the right to supervise all club activities at Hogwarts, including fishing." Lynn laughed aloud at the absurdity. "Fishing is a club activity? Fishing threatens student safety?" Her smile stiffened. "Of course, any unauthorized activity within the school that could endanger students falls under the ministry's supervision. Fishing," she glanced at his rod, "is no exception." Lynn looked down at the rod in his hands and then deadpan said, "Fine, then I want to apply." Umbridge blinked. "Apply? To fish," he said seriously. "You said it needs approval, so where do I get the application form? Whom do I submit it to once it's filled out? How long does the approval process take?" She was unprepared for that. In her scenario, Lynn would have been scolded, pack up, and slink away. Not stand there asking for paperwork like a sensible bureaucrat. This takes time," she stammered. "The ministry's approval process is strict. It's not something you can just apply for on a whim." Lynn nodded, as if he understood. "Roughly how long will it take? A week? A month? A semester?" "Mr. Lynn, I suggest you put your rod away. Until approval is obtained, no fishing is permitted on Hogwarts waters." They stared at each other for a few seconds. Lynn packed his rod with unhurried movements, wound the line, unhooked the lure, and slipped it into his pocket. Umbridge watched, her face relaxing as though order had been restored and her authority confirmed. When he shouldered the rod and turned to leave, he paused, looked back, and called, "Professor Umbridge." She looked up from whatever she'd been contemplating on the rock, that false smile returning. "Yes, Mr. Lynn." "Where do I get the application form?" he asked. "I'll come to your office for it, or do I need to apply directly at the ministry?" Her smile vanished. She stammered, said nothing. Lynn waited a beat, then said, "Then I'll come to you for it first." He turned, rod on his shoulder, and walked back toward the castle. Chapter 322. The door to the Hufflepuff dormitory opened again. Edgar, who had been fiddling with a Quidditch figurine, looked up to see Lynn returning. "How long were you even out? Why are you back already?" he asked, setting the figurine on the table. He glanced at the sun through the window. The sky still hung bright. Only half an hour at most had passed. Lynn casually placed his teen in the corner. Umbridge kicked me out. Edgar's eyes widened. Really? Lynn didn't answer. He only nodded without expression. She didn't give you any face at all? Edgar prodded. Lynn still didn't answer. He went and slipped back into his bed. Edgar and William exchanged a look. Is he angry? William whispered. Even a fool could see that, Edgar muttered. Lynn stayed in bed the entire afternoon. Just as Edgar assumed he had fallen asleep, Lynn re-emerged, looking in a surprisingly good mood, grinning and holding a piece of parchment in his hand. You stayed in bed that long just to find a piece of parchment? Lynn glanced at Edgar, walked over and patted him on the shoulder. Wait for me to get back, and remember to thank me. Without looking back, he left the dormitory again. He headed straight for Umbridge's office on the 4th floor. He knocked. Knock. Knock. The rapping echoed down the quiet corridor. The door stayed closed for a moment before Umbridge's sickly voice floated out. It's after office hours. Please return tomorrow. Lynn didn't care whether she was off duty. He looked at the doorknob, drew his wand, and gave it a light flick. Click. The lock snapped open. Lynn pushed the door and walked in. Umbridge sat behind her desk, stunned, like a toad suddenly exposed to sun. She hadn't expected anyone to walk in uninvited. Mr. Lynn, her voice sharpened, the syrupy facade cracking. What do you think this is, the 3 broomsticks? This is a professor's office. You cannot— Professor, Lynn interrupted. I told you I'd come this afternoon to collect the application form. He enunciated, application form with care. Umbridge's protest died in her throat. She set down her teacup with a sharp clink. There is no application form here, she hissed. Even if there were, I wouldn't give it to you. She paused, and a vicious smile crawled across her face. Her sweet voice returned with a venomous edge. Since you trespassed into a professor's office without permission, I shall punish you. You will write a few sentences, not with your own pen, of course, but with this. She produced a long, thin quill and tossed it to Lynn. He caught it, gave it a glance, and smirked. If I'm not mistaken, this quill seems to be bound with dark arts magic. Dark arts? No. This is merely your punishment, Umbridge said, the fake smile back in place. Dumbledore would never allow dark arts items to be used in school. Dumbledore has no authority over the Ministry of Magic, she snarled viciously. Besides, he won't know. He's long gone from Hogwarts. No one will learn what happens here. I see. Lynn nodded slowly. Then why the hell should I waste my breath talking to you? He drew his wand and casually waved it. The next second, Umbridge was sent flying, slamming into the wall with a heavy thud. The wall decorations rained down. She sat on the floor, backed against the plaster, eyes wide with shock. Only when the pain registered did she realize she had been attacked. Damn you, she shrieked, each word cutting like nails. You, how dare you? Crack. A vase floated from a shelf, drifted over her head, hung a beat, and then shattered on her. Water and petals soaked her. Umbridge's scream choked into coughs. She wiped her face and looked up. One dinner plate after another flew overhead and crashed down onto her. Only then did she remember to resist. As she reached to draw her wand, Lynn flicked his. An invisible blade shot from the tip of his wand, too fast to see. There was only a whisper of sound, like cloth tearing. Umbridge's right hand went suddenly light, gone from the wrist down. The cut was surgical. For a moment, the blood didn't gush. Then it did, hot and bright, spattering across her pink cardigan, her skirt, and the porcelain shards. She let out a high, ragged scream. She clutched the bloody stump and curled up on the floor, her face draining of color. Please, she begged, suddenly small. Please, let me go. I'll agree to anything. Anything. Lynn picked at his ear. We've only just begun. Weren't you about to punish me a moment ago? Umbridge's pleas faltered into wheezing sounds. Lynn looked down at her for several seconds, then crouched to meet her eye. Giving you a pass, he said slowly, isn't out of the question. Her lips trembled. Lynn unfolded the parchment he'd been carrying and spread it out over the broken porcelain before her. It was nearly desk-sized. I have a piece of parchment here, he said, nudging Umbridge's quill toward it. I'll speak, you'll write. Terror filled Umbridge's eyes as she looked at the quill. Listen closely, Lynn said, standing over her. I speak a sentence. You write a sentence. He cleared his throat. Rule number 1. His voice cut through the silence. I, Dolores Umbridge, voluntarily abolish Educational Decree number 22, restoring a beautiful and free learning environment to the students of Hogwarts. Umbridge's hand shook violently. The moment the quill touched the parchment, a searing pain shot through her fingertips as if scalded. She gritted her teeth and began to write. Every word felt like a knife. Red lines flared beneath her skin from fingertip to wrist. Rule number 2, Lynn continued, leisurely. I permit Mr. Lynn to do anything in my class, including but not limited to sleeping, doing homework, daydreaming, eating, leaving early, arriving late, not submitting assignments, not answering questions, not using textbooks, and not following classroom discipline. The quill moved across the page despite her shaking hand. The burning spread like hot wire under her skin, marching up her forearm. By the time she finished not following classroom discipline, red welts had appeared on the back of her hand. Rule number 3. I allow Mr. Lynn to fish in the Black Lake. Methods of fishing include, but are not limited to, 15, 7-10, to 19, 16s, using nets, using harpoons, and using 22 to blast them. No application is needed, no approval is required, and no one's permission is necessary. She wrote on as if carving her own flesh. The red marks crawled past her elbow. She bit her lip until blood trickled into her mouth and onto her cardigan, streaking with the other blood already there. Lynn glanced down at the cramped, crooked handwriting and nodded before pressing on. Rule number 4. Rule number 5. Rule number 6, he recited. Umbridge's arm was a tapestry of red, each rule a branded line. Her face had drained to ashen, her eyes half closed, but still the quill scratched on, clumsy and honest. Rule number 9. Rule number 10. Rule number 11. By the teens, the burning was so fierce she could barely breathe. After the first 3 rules, Lynn's recitations became nonsense, but he continued regardless, watching her falter. Don't be in such a hurry, Professor, he said, as if they were merely having a chat. There are still a few more. Rule number 20. I promise to say, I'm sorry, my previous attitude was wrong to at least 10 students every day. Rule number 30. I promise not to wear any pink clothing while at Hogwarts. Rule number 40. I promise to go to the edge of the Black Lake at least once a week to apologize to the fish. Her hand no longer formed neat letters. It dragged and scratched, the quill scrawling illegible marks as the fire crept toward her shoulder. Her breathing was shallow, her eyelids fluttering. When he finally reached the 50th rule and began to run out of things to say, Lynn started to wrap it up. Rule number 60. Rule number 65, rule number 68, rule number 70. He stopped. The parchment was filled from top to bottom with cramped rules. I, Dolores Umbridge, shall maintain complete secrecy regarding the events that transpired in this office tonight. I will not mention them to anyone, file a complaint with anyone, or use any connections for retaliation. Only you and I shall know what happened tonight. He paused. Finally, sign your name. Umbridge's trembling hand hovered. The burning reached her shoulder. It felt as if red-hot iron gripped her arm. Still, she forced the quill to the paper and wrote, letter by letter, Dolors Umbridge. When she completed the final stroke, the parchment flared as if something inside had been lit. It burned, carbonized, and crumbled to black ash that drifted from between her fingers. Where the ashes fell, a thin golden band appeared on her wrist, glowing for a heartbeat before sinking beneath the skin. Umbridge felt the pulsating mark from within her wrist, something real and binding. Lynn watched until he was sure the unbreakable vow had taken. He smiled, satisfied. With a flick of his wand, Umbridge's severed hand reattached itself. Whether it would ever work the same way again was no longer his concern. He turned to leave. The door closed behind him. As Lynn stepped into the corridor, he looked up and saw Dumbledore standing in the corner, watching him with a complicated expression. Hogsmeade at night was livelier than Lynn had expected. Most of the shops were still lit, warm yellow light spilling from their windows and haloing the street. Wizards passed in 2s and 3s. Some carried bags of sweets from honeydukes, others clutched the latest poetry from Scrivenshafts, and a few middle-aged men, plainly just off work, strolled by grumbling about a new ministry policy. Hogshead Inn, Lynn read the crooked sign aloud. What a strange name. he muttered, following Dumbledore as the old man pushed open the heavy wooden door. The hinges gave a long, unhappy groan. The moment Lynn crossed the threshold, he felt ill. There was a smell, the kind you get when something damp has been stuffed into a corner and left to rot, a sour, moldy tang mixed with dust that suggested the place hadn't been aired in years. He took an instinctive half-step back. The floorboards were fused with grime. This place didn't even compare favorably to the Three Broomsticks. Not even the Dragon Sanctuary in Romania would seem as tidy. At least the cups looked clean and polished, a small mercy. Lynn graded the establishment in his head, barely passing. The pub wasn't crowded. A few crooked tables were scattered about, 2 or 3 people per table. The door hadn't been loud, but it was enough to startle everyone. Heads turned in unison. Their eyes landed on Dumbledore first, then shifted in the same sweep to Lynn, stopping, as always, on the lightning-shaped scar at his brow. Lynn walked on without changing his expression. How deeply ingrained Harry Potter's scar was in people's minds, almost a reflex in the wizarding world. Dumbledore, however, paid them no mind. He nodded to those who stood and said, "Good evening," then led Lynn to a corner table. They sat with their backs to the wall, facing the door, empty tables on both sides, neither conspicuous nor exposed. "Principal," Lynn said, testing, "aren't you supposed to be on vacation? After all the work you've done for the wizarding world, why come back to Hogwarts instead of taking a proper rest?" Dumbledore straightened a candlestick and paused. "I remembered something in my office," he trailed off, then added, "and do not change the subject, child." Lynn shrugged and leaned back, all casual. "Fine, speak, I'm listening." He gave a small scoff. "Anyway, I don't think I did anything wrong." He sounded righteously sure of himself. Dumbledore watched him for a long moment. "Child," he said at last, "power does not solve everything." Lynn lifted an eyebrow. "Power does stop people from riding roughshod over you," he said bluntly. "Principal, do you have no opinion on this ridiculous educational decree?" Dumbledore hesitated. Lynn's language was crude, but the point rang true. "Of course I have an opinion," he said, "but perhaps you might try gentler methods." For a beat, Dumbledore almost contradicted himself. Lynn's methods did seem effective, and at least the boy now knew how to sign proper contracts. He looked at Lynn and felt a small, private satisfaction at his pupil's growth. Lynn, though, was thinking of something else. Was Dumbledore really on vacation by choice? He pressed the question. Dumbledore sipped his pumpkin juice, set the cup down, and sighed. "Sometimes," he said, with a shade of helplessness, "an appropriate compromise is needed to prevent certain conflicts from escalating." Lynn nodded. "Is it because of the ministry?" "Yes." Dumbledore's sigh deepened. "Cornelius Fudge and I are nearly at the point of a complete falling out." He shook his head as if recalling a bitter argument. "We argued. He refuses to believe that Lord Voldemort has returned." When Dumbledore said the name, his voice didn't change, calm, as if discussing the weather. But Lynn noticed a wizard at a nearby table freeze the instant he heard it and quickly pay his bill with his head down. He slipped out the door before anyone could take much notice. Dumbledore didn't seem to care. "I must do my best to persuade him," Dumbledore went on. "I cannot stand aside while people die because they were unprepared." Lynn scratched his head. "Why not leave it? If the ministry is holding you back and you're the only one acting, you're wasting your time." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "I will do what I can, as soon as I can." Lynn thought some more and then spoke plainly. "Forgive my bluntness, Principal. Fudge only put Umbridge in because he's afraid someone will threaten his position. Now, after Barty Crouch Sr.'s death, who's left to threaten him? So if you keep handling Fudge like you always have, you're wasting effort." A scoffing sound came from the counter as the owner, carrying 2 cups of pumpkin juice, sneered, "Such a simple matter, and the great Dumbledore needs a child to remind him." Dumbledore glanced at him but ignored the taunt, looking back at Lynn. "Tell me your thoughts." Lynn didn't hold back. "Then change the Minister for Magic." "No." Dumbledore's voice came out sharper than before. "Replacing the minister suddenly would cause unnecessary panic. That is exactly what Lord Voldemort would want to see." He spoke as much to convince himself as to convince Lynn. "I cannot let that happen." Lynn fell silent for a moment, then said with growing heat, "But you can't have a teammate in the back making matters worse. You charge ahead and Fudge tears the stage down from behind, stirring people to slander you. That's what Voldemort wants. He leaned in. I think, Principal, you should be Minister for Magic. No. Dumbledore shook his head, more emphatic this time. Absolutely not. He looked at Lynn with a seriousness that made Lynn frown. I know your idea comes from what happened today, he said lower, but Cornelius Fudge is still the minister. He must remain so. Lynn's temper flared. Why are you so stubborn, old man? No means no. Lynn, don't have the idea that I should become minister. The owner sneered again, loud enough for the room to hear. You truly are old. Your mind isn't even as clear as a child's. Lynn turned his head and studied the man. He looked remarkably like Dumbledore, high cheekbones, a long nose, the same blue eyes. But where Dumbledore's face held the softening lines of age, this one seemed carved by a harsher hand. Sir, Lynn said politely, but with a razor under the words, that the principal and I are talking. You eavesdropping isn't appropriate, is it? The owner stared at him for a beat, then away. Is it? He replied, not really to Lynn. Dumbledore answered after a moment of silence. It is. The owner nodded, as if he'd expected that. He fumbled a crumpled note from his pocket, slapped it on the table, and turned back toward the bar. He is my brother, Dumbledore said across the table. Aberforth Dumbledore. Lynn stared after the retreating, broad-shouldered figure, and then at Dumbledore, trying to fit the puzzle pieces of their relationship together. You two, he began cautiously. You don't seem very close. Dumbledore didn't reply immediately. He picked up the note and read aloud in disbelief. 500 galleons? Aberforth's voice carried from the back of the pub like it was right beside them. There's nothing wrong with the bill, he said, wiping a glass without looking up. Most of the people here are your students. They ordered 21 bottles of soda, 22 watermelon sodas, 8 pints of beer, and assorted other things. 500 galleons is exactly right. He finally looked up and fixed his gaze on Dumbledore. Pay up. Lynn glanced at the bill and did a quick mental sum. At the 3 broomsticks, that tab would have been at most 50 galleons. Aberforth's prices were easily 10 times that. Even Fred and George only doubled prices for Ron. This was something else. Dumbledore let out a small sound and took a cloth bag from his pocket, setting it on the table without looking. The bag hit the wood with a thud, and the coins inside clinked. The pub went quiet, then someone cheered from a corner. The principal is generous. Praise the principal. Praise the professor. Voices rose in different directions. Dumbledore smiled and nodded, then looked back at Lynn. Where were we? He said, then paused. Ah, Lynn, your idea is impractical. His tone softened. Get some rest, think on it, and you may see things differently. Principal, Dumbledore made a small, elegant wave. Fawkes burst from a corner and landed on his shoulder. With a flash of fire, Lynn found himself back in the Hufflepuff common room. He stared. Fawkes was preparing to fly off again. Lynn reached and grabbed one of the phoenix's legs. Fawkes paused in mid-flap, cocked his head. What is it? The bird seemed to ask. Help me deliver something to Professor Dumbledore. Fawkes bobbed once, a feathered nod. Lynn flicked his wand. A sheet of parchment and a quill flew into his hand. He set the quill to the page and with a flourish wrote a single honest line. Saying you are a stubborn old man is no exaggeration at all. Chapter 324, Dumbledore's Scandal. Since returning from the Hog's Head that night, Lynn hadn't made any effort to pay attention to Umbridge. It wasn't that he wanted to ignore her. There simply wasn't any need. Umbridge's behavior at Hogwarts had gone from one extreme to the other. Every morning in the Great Hall, she still sat at the teacher's table in her signature pink cardigan, a bow at her collar, and a hair clip in place. But the expression on her face had changed completely. Where there had once been a deliberately saccharine smile, now there was a strained, half-forced attempt at cheerfulness. The corners of her mouth turned up while her eyes drooped. The muscles of her face tugged in different directions, producing something more grotesque than crying. Sometimes, while eating, Lynn would glance at the teacher's table without meaning to. He would see Umbridge sitting absolutely rigid, back straight, hands neatly folded on her knees, head slightly bowed, eyes fixed on the plate in front of her, as if she were studying the grain of the roasted potato. She rarely looked up. When she did, it was only a quick, furtive glance before lowering her head again. Her posture wasn't like a teacher's, so much as a student in class, desperately trying to make themselves invisible for fear of being called on. At the Hufflepuff table, talk of Umbridge had become a regular feature. "Have you noticed," Justin Finch Fletchley whispered, fork poised over a piece of steak, "she hasn't stood up at all during class today." Hannah Abbott leaned in. "She didn't stand up during class before either." "Not that kind of not standing up," Justin said, searching for the right words. "She's shrinking behind the podium, like she wants to hide. When she reads from the textbook, her voice is quieter than before. I was sitting in the third row and could barely hear her." "What's the problem with that?" Ernie Macmillan leaned over. "Isn't it better if she's quiet? You can sleep." "I'm not complaining." Justin rolled his eyes. "I just think it's strange. A few days ago, she was still acting all high and mighty, and now she's like this." Hannah considered. "Could Headmaster Dumbledore have said something to her?" "Isn't Dumbledore on holiday?" Ernie said. "Then Professor McGonagall?" Nobody could guess. Susan Bones set down her pumpkin juice with a look as if she knew all the answers. "Whoever spoke to her, the important thing is she doesn't dare cause trouble now. Don't you miss the days when she made us read the textbook?" Several of them shook their heads in unison. "Forget it," Justin said. "I'd rather have Snape's class than listen to her read." "At least you learn something in Snape's class," Ernie added, "and it builds your stress tolerance." The group laughed. The sound carried to the teacher's table. Umbridge's shoulders trembled, and she bowed her head even lower. Aside from the daily defense against the dark arts lessons, Umbridge had almost vanished from Hogwarts. She rarely appeared in the corridors. Previously, she liked to patrol between classes, scrutinizing students as if picking the next target for education. Now the corridors were filled only with footsteps and laughter. A pink shape would appear in a distant corner from time to time, pause as if hesitating to cross, then hurry away. Lynn had the impression that if she didn't have to teach defense against the dark arts, she might not show her face at all. Umbridge's sudden low profile aroused displeasure elsewhere, especially in Cornelius Fudge. The fire in the minister's office burned high, warming the room. Fudge sat behind his large desk with papers spread before him, but he wasn't reading. His eyes were glued to the communication screen. On it was the message he'd sent to Umbridge hours ago, which still had no reply. He tapped the desk twice, picked up the communicator, and sent another message. "Dolores, I need an explanation." He waited 5 minutes. The screen lit up. "Minister, I am currently investigating." Fudge stared at the words. Investigating what? She'd been at Hogwarts almost a month and hadn't even touched the subject of Dumbledore. Now she said she was currently investigating? He inhaled and typed fast. "Investigating? Dolores, you've been there nearly a month. I want results, not processes. It's impossible that Dumbledore has no dirt on him after all these years. Find something." This time the reply came after a longer wait. "Minister, the situation is rather complicated." Fudge slammed down the communicator, paced the office twice. Since Dumbledore's words at the end of term feast, "Lord Voldemort has returned," Fudge had not slept. The sentence had detonated like a bomb in the wizarding world. He'd tried to dismiss it at a press conference, to call Dumbledore's claims delusions, to insist there was no evidence that you-know-who had returned. But some people believed Dumbledore. Panic spreading would topple the ministry's authority and his own. Those who supported him would abandon him, opponents would pounce, and he, Cornelius Fudge, would be remembered as the incompetent minister who failed in a crisis. He couldn't let that happen. Dumbledore had to be silenced. But Dumbledore wasn't an ordinary man. He was the greatest wizard of the age, president of the International Confederation of Wizards, and a respected leader in the Wizengamot. His reputation was untouchable. If he couldn't touch Dumbledore, he would go after those around him. Hogwarts was Dumbledore's base. If Fudge could find problems at Hogwarts, show the public that school management was chaotic, that Dumbledore was unfit, then everything would be easier. So he had sent Umbridge. She was his confidant, one he trusted, loyal and capable and unafraid to offend. Sending her to Hogwarts had seemed perfect. And now she told him the situation was rather complicated. Fudge picked up the communicator again. "Dolores, I am warning you for the last time. The ministry's attention to Hogwarts will not stop because you have retreated. Dumbledore's so-called vacation is only the beginning. I am officially appointing you High Inquisitor of the Ministry of Magic, responsible for inspecting Hogwarts. You have the authority to inspect the qualifications, content, and methods of all staff. You must, no matter what, get me the dirt on Dumbledore. In her office, Umbridge stared at the screen, heart sinking. A month ago, the title High Inquisitor of the Ministry of Magic would have filled her with pride. Now it felt like the sky was falling. Her finger hovered over the keys, trembling before she typed, "Minister, I need time." A few days later at midday, Lynn, who had been busy all morning, was starving. He dashed to the Hufflepuff table, grabbed a chicken leg, and started devouring it. Edgar sat beside him, watching. "Slow down. No one is going to steal it," he said. Mmm, Lynn answered with his mouth full, not slowing his hand. As he ate, fragments of conversation drifted to him. Professor Black. Taken away. Injured. He slowed his chewing and looked toward the middle of the Hufflepuff table. Several fourth-year girls were huddled together, whispering with serious expressions, glancing from time to time toward the teacher's table. "Why did the ministry take Professor Black away?" a girl with a ponytail whispered. "It seems a student was injured in class." "What happened?" her friend asked. "I heard someone caused an explosion during Transfiguration," the ponytail girl said quietly. Then ministry officials came, saying Professor Black's teaching methods were unsafe and wanted to take him for questioning. "But accidents happen in Transfiguration," a short-haired girl objected. "I once turned a mouse into a lump and no one came to investigate Professor McGonagall." "That's different," the ponytail girl replied. "Professor McGonagall is a full professor. Black is only a teaching assistant, and you know his history. Coming out of Azkaban, even if he was wrongly imprisoned, the ministry is watching him." Lynn frowned, listening, as similar talk rose from the Ravenclaw table. Then the great hall doors opened quietly, but clearly above the murmur. Everyone looked up. Professor McGonagall entered, followed by Umbridge. They walked to the front of the teacher's table. McGonagall turned to face the hall. "Please be quiet." The chatter died down. "I need to make an announcement," she said calmly. "Regarding the Transfiguration teaching assistant, Mr. Black." She paused. "He must cooperate with the Ministry of Magic in an investigation and will not be able to continue teaching during this period." A beat of silence. Then an indignant voice rose from the Gryffindor side. "He didn't do anything wrong." Whispers spread like a tide. McGonagall waited a few seconds, then raised a hand and pressed it down. The voices faded. "The ministry will announce details of the investigation at an appropriate time," she said. "Until then, please refrain from speculation." She nodded at Umbridge, signaling she could speak. Umbridge stepped to the center of the teacher's table. Just as she began to expound on her new appointment as High Inquisitor and her responsibility for inspecting the staff, she suddenly met Lynn's cold gaze. The color drained from her face. She finished the formalities quickly and scurried back to her office. Lynn watched her leave, feeling his earlier warning to her had been insufficient. The fourth-floor corridor was quiet. Most students were either returning to their common rooms or already eating. Lynn walked to Umbridge's office door and stopped. He raised his wand and kicked the door open. Umbridge sat in her chair, back to the door. At the sound, she startled and froze. She slowly turned. When her eyes met Lynn's, it felt as if cold had poured through her body from the soles of her feet up to her heart. Her heartbeat skipped a beat, then hammered. Before she could speak, Lynn cast a bone-breaking curse at her hand. "Mr. Lynn," she gasped, "this is a misunderstanding. It's all a misunderstanding." "What is there to misunderstand?" Lynn said. "Do you dare deny that Sirius was taken on your orders?" Umbridge trembled, sobbing, producing a stream of complaints and excuses. "I was forced to. It was Minister Fudge's order. I didn't want it either." Lynn felt a headache coming on listening to it all. If he could, he'd have liked to replace the minister himself in that moment. But considering the school and the old headmaster, he decided on another plan. "Umbridge," she shook violently. I'm here." Lynn crouched to meet her eyes. "I need you to do something." Her pupils dilated. You want me to." "Take a message to the minister." Umbridge stared. "A message?" Lynn stood and dusted his knees off as if they were dirty. "Tell him this," he considered, then said, "I have dirt on Dumbledore. I want to discuss it with him in detail. The office seemed to stop breathing. What did you say? I have dirt on Dumbledore, Lynn repeated. I want to discuss it with Minister Fudge. He paused. If you don't want to be in mortal danger right now, he said, his gaze locking on her, then deliver this message. Umbridge trembled, then answered in a small but certain voice, I will deliver it. I will deliver it. Lynn nodded. Very good. He turned for the door, then paused after 2 steps. Oh, right, about Professor Black. I'll find a way, Umbridge blurted. Lynn looked back at her. Can you do it? Yes, Umbridge nodded vigorously. I can. I definitely can. It was Friday again. Early morning wrapped Hogwarts in gray, and a fine mist condensed on the window panes. Lynn fumbled out of bed and glanced outside. The sky was the color of a rag washed too many times. Clouds hung low as if they might collapse. The rain wasn't heavy, but steady, a fine diagonal drizzle that rattled the windows. This weather again, Lynn muttered, pulling the quilt up and then burrowing back under it. It had been raining since Monday. Very British. Hogwarts' Quidditch players, especially the Hufflepuffs, seemed oblivious to the weather. They never missed practice. You have no idea how crazy Cedric is, Edgar had said to Lynn the day before. In this weather, he actually said, light rain's better for training. It improves reaction speeds. Lynn almost thought he was listening to Oliver Wood. After morning lessons, Lynn, Edgar, William, and Ollie went to the Great Hall to eat. Hogsmeade's tomorrow, Edgar said, sounding pleased. Lynn, want to come with us for a walk? Before Lynn could answer, a voice cut in. Lynn. He turned to see the Weasley twins striding over with their usual mischief. Fred gave Edgar, who was sitting beside Lynn, an expert shove, sending Edgar sliding halfway off his chair. Edgar glared, but Fred didn't even notice. He grabbed one of Lynn's arms like he might bolt. Hogsmeade tomorrow. Come with us, Fred said. George squeezed in from the other side and pushed William aside. Lynn found himself sandwiched between the two, arms pinned left and right. I don't really want to go, Lynn said, helpless. Don't be like that. Fred's voice shot up, his grip tightening. Why not bring your brother instead? Fred and George exchanged a look. What would little Ronnie know about business? Fred said. Lynn hesitated. The twins had mentioned before they planned to open a joke shop after graduation and might need his help. Lynn had agreed casually once. Sure, just tell me when you need assistance. Now they'd come to collect on that promise, and he felt awkward refusing. Have you saved enough galleons? He asked. George pinched his thumb and forefinger together in a cheeky gesture and shook his head. Still short, he said. But the ministry has startup loans with low interest. We worked it out. 1 loan would do if we find the right place. So we're going to Hogsmeade tomorrow to look at shops, Fred added, eyes bright. And we'll show you around. You haven't properly explored Hogsmeade, have you? Lynn wanted to say he'd been there several times. All right, he said, but I'm no business expert. Both twins froze for a second, then burst out laughing as if he'd told the funniest joke. Not good at business? Fred choked on his laughter. Your shop in Diagon Alley, practically monopolizes the alchemy market. George was laughing until he could barely breathe. Lynn shrugged with an innocent look. It was true. Eiley ran the businesses, the puppets did production, the Malfoys supplied materials. He only checked the ledgers and counted the galleons each month. He wasn't involved in day-to-day management. No one believed him. Fred patted his shoulder in understanding. Low profile, we get it. Lynn began to ask what exactly they meant, then stopped. He couldn't explain it simply, and it was easier not to. A flutter of wings sounded overhead. Lynn looked up and saw an owl wobble in and swoop toward him. It circled once, loosened its talons, and a single letter drifted down, flipping twice before landing on the table. The owl didn't wait for a reply. It took off into the rain. People still write letters? Lynn muttered, picking it up. The envelope was plain brown, no wax seal, no crest, no return address. Only his name, Lynn, was written on the front. He tore it open. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice. He unfolded it and read one line. See you at the 3 Broomsticks on Saturday. No greeting, no signature. As Lynn wondered who'd sent it, he noticed Professor Umbridge looking his way from the staff table. Everything clicked into place. He'd been puzzling over the ministry's silence in class earlier, thinking Fudge was unusually patient. He hadn't expected a letter so soon. Lynn folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "Who's the letter from?" Edgar leaned over. "No one," Lynn said casually. "Spam." Edgar gave him a suspicious look but didn't press it. Saturday came. Lynn was up early. For once, he hadn't woken himself. Fred and George hauled him out of bed. "Get up! Get up!" Fred's shout at the dormitory door sent Edgar tumbling from his bed, hair all over the place. "What? What?" Edgar sat on the floor, dazed, while the twins said, "Not you. We're here for Lynn." Lynn peeked from under the covers and looked out. The sky was still gray. The rain had stopped, but clouds hunched like a secret. "What time is it?" he asked. "Nearly 7, Fred said. Lynn pulled the quilt up again. "Too early. Let me sleep a bit more." "No way!" The twins shouted in unison and rushed in, each grabbing an arm and dragging him out of bed. "Hogsmeade takes all day. Go early. Come back early," Fred cried. "We need to look at shops," George added. Lynn was carried out with his feet dangling. Saturdays in Hogsmeade were lively. Lynn followed the twins up and down the street, then back again, and they looked at least 10 shops. Some fronts were on the main road, with big display windows and terrifyingly high rent. Others were tucked in alleys, narrow and cheap. Several had "for transfer" signs and dust-layered panes like they'd been empty for ages. In front of each, Fred and George lingered, gesturing and discussing suitability, what to sell where, how to decorate, foot traffic, whether being near Honeydukes would steal business. Lynn listened, nodding, "Not bad," or "Let's see more" when asked. By midday, they'd found a few promising places. One on the main street was small, but ideally located right next to Honeydukes. The retired old man who owned it didn't ask for much rent. "It's been idle, so a bit of income will do," he'd said. Another was a narrow shop down an alley, barely wide enough for 2 people, but very deep and with a decent backyard. George liked the backyard at once. "We can put trial products out back. Customers can try before they buy." Fred liked the rent of a different shop at the end of the street. The twins stood at that door, working sums in their heads, then looked at each other and nodded. "Talk it over later," Fred said. "Yeah, discuss it when we're back," George agreed. They left decisively, without hesitation. Lynn headed alone for the 3 broomsticks. He thought he was late, but Fudge was even later. He found a quiet corner by the wall with a view of the door. A barmaid in an apron came over and took his order. He asked for a butterbeer. "Anything else?" she asked. "No, that's all." She nodded and left. A bubbling glass of butterbeer arrived shortly after. It was sweet, slightly tangy, ice cold and refreshing. Lynn settled back in his chair and watched the door. 10 minutes passed. 20. Half an hour, and his butterbeer was gone, so he ordered another. 40 minutes. 50. An hour. He was beginning to worry that he'd been stood up. A minister for magic wouldn't be so flippant, unless Umbridge hadn't delivered the message. But with the way she'd acted that day, she'd seemed eager to call Fudge on the spot. How could she not have passed it on? Just as he was thinking this, the 3 broomsticks' door swung open again. 326, Chapter 326. Dumbledore wants to run for Minister of Magic? "Oh, Minister!" Madame Rosmerta popped her head out from behind the bar, pleasantly surprised. "How did you find the time to come to Hogsmeade?" Fudge doffed his hat, revealing his well-kept round face. "I missed your place, of course," he said. "To be honest, I've been wanting a drink ever since I finished work." Lynn clicked his tongue inwardly. Politicians lied as easily as they breathed. The minister claiming he'd come to Hogsmeade just for a drink? No one would believe that if you said it outright, but Madame Rosmerta clearly took him at his word. "Thank you for the compliment, Minister." She turned to Umbridge, who was standing rigidly behind Fudge. "And, Senior Undersecretary, what will you have?" Umbridge took a step forward. "Mead, with a cherry." Madame Rosmerta's smile tightened for a heartbeat. She had to steady it quickly, said, "Please wait a moment," and bustled off. Fudge let his gaze sweep the pub, and paused when it landed on Lynn in the corner. "Long time no see, Lynn." He waved, smiling with an ease that looked practiced. Anyone who didn't know better would think they were old friends. Lynn inclined his head slightly and returned the faintest of smiles. Fudge crossed the room and sat opposite him. Umbridge followed and perched, stiff as ever, at the far edge of Lynn's bench, as if afraid to touch him. Madame Rosmerta returned with a tray, setting a glass in front of Fudge and another in front of Umbridge. Fudge sipped his and praised it as fine liquor. Rosmerta smiled, told him to drink slowly, and went back to the bar. Fudge set his glass down and launched into small talk. Lovely weather today, isn't it? Lynn glanced at the gray sky outside the window and said nothing. How have things at Hogwarts been? Fudge pressed on. Are the courses intense? You're in your 5th year. The OWLs are coming up soon, aren't they? They're fine, Lynn replied. Dolores told me your reports on the students, always excellent. Fudge put on a benevolent tone, the sort that meant, I care about students. A first-class order of Merlin, remarkable. To achieve so much so young, you have a bright future ahead. You flatter me, Lynn said. And so it went. Weather, Hogwarts, the OWL exams, the Quidditch World Cup, this year's harvest, a new ministry policy. For every question Fudge asked, Lynn offered a short, measured answer. Topics flitted from one to another, each more vacuous than the last. Umbridge sat beside them, head bowed, sipping her mead with a cherry. Lynn wasn't in a hurry either. If Fudge wanted conversation, he'd provide it. He had nothing to do and had already had enough of the pub's stronger fare. This was simply a performance to watch. Fudge's ramblings wandered, with practiced nonsensical detours to the International Confederation of Wizards, and then, improbably, to what materials some African tribe used to make certain charms. Lynn listened and nodded now and then, curious to see how long the minister could keep up the act. 10 minutes later, Fudge finally steered the talk toward Dumbledore. How has Dumbledore been lately? He asked casually. I heard he's on leave. Lynn watched the minister's face, trying very hard to look casual, and clicked his tongue inwardly. Yes, Minister. Professor McGonagall said Headmaster Dumbledore is taking leave. Oh, a leave is well-deserved. Fudge nodded as if he truly understood. After serving the wizarding world so long, he should rest. He touched his glass and then, as if remembering something, lowered his voice. By the way, Dolores told me you wanted to see me? Here it came. Lynn set his glass down and adopted the solemn expression of a citizen with weighty concerns. He furrowed his brow and spoke in a low tone. Yes, Minister, there is something I think you should know. Fudge fought to keep a smile from breaking across his face. Oh, what is it? It's about Headmaster Dumbledore, Lynn said. He's going to run for Minister for Magic. Lynn's voice was calm and precise. The smile slid off Fudge's face in an instant. For a couple of seconds, 3, perhaps more, Fudge stared before his whole expression shifted. What did you say? His hand slammed down on the table with a heavy bang. The glasses jumped. Dumbledore, running for Minister for Magic? He repeated the words as if confirming them aloud. Lynn had expected tests, skepticism, requests for proof, anything to buy time. Instead, Fudge abandoned pretense entirely, which suited Lynn fine. The bigger the reaction, the better the performance. Yes, Minister, Lynn said evenly. Some time ago I attended a meeting he held. He said it himself. Absurd, Fudge snapped, straightening. Ridiculous. You expect me to believe that? Fudge's tone shook. His face didn't read I don't believe it so much as I dare not believe it. Lynn watched and pressed. It's true, Lynn said softly. I heard it. He said it in front of many people. He deliberately left out specifics. Who was there when it happened? Vague details let others fill in blanks, and people are inclined to believe the story they build themselves. Fudge's lips moved as he tried to gather himself. He said he intends to run for minister? More than that, Lynn continued. Dumbledore also spoke about the return of you-know-who. At that, Fudge's reaction was instantaneous. The ministry has said time and again that he cannot return. Lynn ignored the sharp look and went on. Dumbledore believes he can come back, and he thinks that fact can be used to his advantage. Fudge faltered. Everyone knows Dumbledore is the only one capable of dealing with you-know-who. He trailed off. That would give him enormous prestige very quickly, Lynn finished for him. Fudge's eyes flickered, and he sank back, suddenly thoughtful. I'm curious, he said, voice regaining its forced calm. What else did he say at this meeting? Lynn saw the hook. He allowed himself a faint, satisfied lift of his brow and spoke, measuring his words. He said that once elected minister, he would go all out to spread the news that you-know-who has been resurrected. Fudge stared. Why on earth? This was the reaction Lynn expected. Fudge's mind was racing. How would announcing you-know-who's return benefit Dumbledore? Wouldn't it cause panic, chaos, and make him look incompetent as minister? But Lynn had the answer ready. because only then can he legitimately declare the wizarding world to be in a state of war. Fudge's pupils shrank. And in wartime, there are no ministerial elections, he finished in a hoarse whisper. As long as he doesn't make any catastrophic mistakes, he could effectively remain in office indefinitely. With that, the glass in Fudge's hand slipped and crashed to the floor, shattering. Heads turned. Madame Rosmerta looked up from behind the bar. A few customers glanced around, curious. Lynn watched Fudge. There was no longer even a trace of worry about Dumbledore usurping power. Only a hard, calculating expression remained. "Lynn, I'm glad you told me this." Fudge drew a deep breath to steady himself. "You've done the wizarding world a great service." "It's what I should do," Lynn said, keeping his tone modest. "Very good," Fudge repeated, his voice regaining a sliver of ministerial composure. A short silence fell. Lynn glanced at his watch. Time had slipped away. His pleasant Saturday was almost over. "Minister," he said, standing, "I have a class this afternoon. I should be off." Fudge nodded quickly, probably not fully hearing. Lynn shrugged into his coat and walked out of the Three Broomsticks, leaving a deeply thoughtful minister behind. Chapter 327. "This is outrageous!" 8th floor, Headmaster's office. Dumbledore had finally returned to Hogwarts after more than 2 months away. He leaned back in his chair, one hand on the armrest and the other resting around a cup of tea gone cold. He hadn't drunk it. His eyes were fixed on the spread of daily profits before him, a complicated expression on his face. Though he'd been on holiday, he had not missed a single paper he ought to have read. He could almost recite the headlines from the past weeks. They were all the same. A high-ranking ministry official, who preferred to remain anonymous, called Dumbledore's claims about you-know-who's return seriously irresponsible. Another authority warned his recent behavior was worrisome and urged the ministry to intervene. A well-informed source insisted Dumbledore was spreading rumors to distract from his poor management of Hogwarts. Every article ended the same way, categorically insisting it was impossible that Voldemort had returned, that Dumbledore was lying, and that the public should not be fooled. Circles of identical accusations repeated day after day. Dumbledore could have recited it by heart, but today's issue was different. Under the usual barrage, a single line read, "Regarding whether you-know-who has returned, the Ministry of Magic is still investigating. Relevant sources say the evidence is not yet sufficient to reach a clear conclusion and further verification is needed." From absolutely impossible to awaiting verification. The shift was too significant to be coincidental. It satisfied Dumbledore, but another headline left him more discomposed. The truth behind Dumbledore's vacation. He intends to run for Minister for Magic. The article wasn't long. The byline was a name Dumbledore had never heard, Chibian Ubian. The famous Albus Dumbledore has been in frequent contact with high-level ministry staff in recent days, the piece began. Sources say he appears unhappy with Minister Cornelius Fudge's public attacks and intends to run for minister to restore his reputation. According to well-placed sources, Dumbledore has held private meetings with several members of the Wizengamot about a possible candidacy. A high-ranking ministry official, speaking anonymously, stated that if Dumbledore truly runs, he would undoubtedly become the strongest contender. Dumbledore closed the paper and let out a slow sigh. His gaze drifted across the office and landed on a corner where Lynn was crouched beside Fawkes's perch, absent-mindedly plucking at the phoenix's feathers. "Mr. Lynn," Dumbledore said. Lynn's hand paused, then resumed its motion. Dumbledore waved the newspaper. "Can you explain this?" Lynn glanced at the paper and back at Dumbledore. "Headmaster, I don't understand what you mean. Isn't this your doing?" Dumbledore asked. "Of course not," Lynn blurted with such instant conviction that Dumbledore raised an eyebrow. "But you haven't even heard what it says," Dumbledore interrupted mildly. An awkward silence fell. Color rose in Lynn's cheeks. "Whatever it claims," he said, stiff with moral certainty, "it isn't me." Dumbledore watched him a beat, then opened the drawer under his desk with a soft thud. He set on the desk a stack of envelopes a foot high. "You probably don't know," he said leisurely, "but in the last few hours I've received this many letters." He tapped the stack. "From this morning until now, in less than half a day." Lynn stared at the pile in silence. Dumbledore plucked the top envelope, tore it open, and read aloud. Dear Headmaster Dumbledore, I was a student of yours when you taught at Hogwarts. Although you may not remember me, I have always admired you. I was thrilled to read in the paper that you intend to run for Minister for Magic. If you need any help, please contact me at any time. I will do anything for you. Publicity, contacting alumni, financial support. He glanced at the signature. Yours faithfully, so-and-so. He opened a second. Albus, I'm your former classmate. I'm not surprised to hear you might run. You should have done it long ago. That fellow Fudge doesn't deserve the post. If you need help getting votes, ask. Your old friend, so-and-so. A third. Headmaster Dumbledore, I'm a reporter for the Daily Prophet. May I ask if you truly intend to run? If so, could I arrange an exclusive interview? I'd like to write a special piece. The fourth, fifth, sixth. Dumbledore read them one by one. Almost all were the same. Support, offers to help, requests for interviews. This is only a portion of them, he said. At that moment, wings flapped outside the window. An owl slipped through and dropped a white envelope onto the pile with precise grace. Dumbledore looked up and sighed. See? Everyone has taken that article as the truth. They think I really want to run for minister. He tapped the stack again, a note of helplessness in his voice. They're even offering advice and plans, though most of them I've never met. Honestly, I'm beginning to fear owls, he added. Lynn nearly laughed, but held himself. This might not be all bad, he muttered under his breath. Dumbledore's hearing was keen. His eyes twinkled. If you don't come up with a solution, then don't even think of fishing at Hogwarts ever again. Lynn's face fell. This was too much. I don't have one, he snapped suddenly. Either change the minister, or have Fudge go head-to-head with Lord Voldemort. He tapped the desk for emphasis. Pick one. Dumbledore and Lynn simply stared at each other. Changing the minister is impossible, Dumbledore said calmly. And as for having Fudge confront Lord Voldemort, he allowed himself a little inward smile at the absurd mental picture of Fudge, stomach protruding, standing before Voldemort and raising his wand to say, Avada! That won't work either, he finished. Lynn shrugged as if all options were exhausted. Then there's nothing to talk about. Their stalemate was broken by a knock at the door. Come in, Dumbledore called. The door opened, and Sirius Black swaggered in, a half-smile on his face. Good morning, Albus, he said, then glanced at Lynn. And Mr. Lynn. Good morning, Sirius, Dumbledore returned. Welcome back, Professor Black, Lynn added. Sirius made a face at the title. No, just Sirius. Professor makes me feel awkward. He pulled out a chair and sat as if he owned the place. After a moment, he set aside the ease and turned serious. Dumbledore, he said, I'm here to tender my resignation. The office quieted. Dumbledore frowned. Sirius, you were doing well as a teaching assistant. Why resign? Sirius leaned back, one leg crossed over the other. Come off it. I know my limits in Transfiguration. If I stay teaching, I'll just be leading the students astray. Lynn, standing to one side, couldn't help a private thought that it was a pity Fudge lacked such self-awareness. Sirius continued. Besides, I'd rather be out dealing with Death Eaters. McGonagall told me on my way here that their activities are getting more frequent. Dumbledore sighed. Yes, their activities have increased. The Ministry has found dark marks in several places. Fudge calls them pranks by a few extremists, but he's wrong. Voldemort is maneuvering. He's preparing for something larger. Are you sure you won't reconsider? Dumbledore asked. Professor McGonagall will be reluctant to lose such a capable assistant. I'm certain, Sirius added with a half grin, and if I stay any longer, it's not as if I'm getting paid. Lynn couldn't help but laugh outright. Dumbledore let it go. He took a sheet of parchment from the drawer, spread it on the desk, picked up a quill, and wrote. Today is Sunday, he said as he penned the final line. Spend some more time with Harry before you go. Sirius nodded. I will. Dumbledore handed the parchment to him. Sirius folded it without looking and slid it into his pocket. Thanks, Albus. He stood. I'll be off then. Very well, Dumbledore said. Sirius waved to Lynn. Take care, Lynn. Safe travels, Lynn called back. The office quieted once more. Dumbledore had just begun to speak when Lynn suddenly slammed his hand down on the desk. Bang! The portrait stirred and muttered in surprise. Either change the minister, or let Fudge go fight Lord Voldemort. Lynn shouted, and then without waiting for a response, he bolted from the headmaster's office, leaving Dumbledore alone and bewildered. Ever since Dumbledore returned to Hogwarts from his leave, the atmosphere in the school had shifted. The most obvious change was in Dolores Umbridge. It was like she'd become a different person, or rather, reverted to her original self. The caution she'd shown recently was evaporating. That ingratiating, officious energy was coming back. She still flinched when she saw Lynn, but Lynn felt she didn't seem quite as afraid of him as before. Was it because Dumbledore was back? Did she think she wouldn't dare act openly with Dumbledore watching? Before Lynn could figure it out, Dumbledore summoned him to the headmaster's office with a single phone call. "Mr. Lynn, do you have time right now? Could you come to the headmaster's office?" Lynn glanced at his watch. He had less than 5 minutes until his next class. "Headmaster, I'm about to teach." "I've already asked Professor Flitwick for leave on your behalf," Dumbledore said. "He said it's no problem." Lynn went quiet. He had a bad feeling. Headmaster. He sat in the chair across the desk and got straight to the point. "What is it?" "I have some news," Dumbledore said. "Fudge has admitted that Voldemort has returned." Lynn's eyes widened. "I heard you correctly?" His voice was thick with disbelief. "Fudge, the same Fudge who told the Prophet 100 times that you-know-who could never come back, he admitted Voldemort is back?" "Yes," Dumbledore said. Lynn waited a beat. "And then?" Dumbledore blinked. "And then what?" "Did he admit it publicly? Did he put it on the front page of the Daily Prophet? Hold a press conference?" "No," Dumbledore interrupted. "There has been no public announcement. He fears causing a panic." Lynn's mouth opened and closed. He stared at Dumbledore's calm face, frustration bubbling up. "Then what good does that do?" "Headmaster, you haven't gone senile, have you?" Dumbledore gave a helpless little smile. "This is the greatest compromise possible at this stage." The word compromise made Lynn's eyelid twitch. An impulse made him ask, "What did you compromise this time?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "My authority," he said. The answer hung there without context. Lynn looked baffled, but when Dumbledore didn't elaborate, he let it drop. He leaned back and changed the subject. "So you called me here just to tell me this? Not so good news?" Dumbledore nodded. "Does this make you less inclined to replace the Minister for Magic?" Lynn frowned and said nothing for a moment. "No," he answered finally. "I still want him replaced, but since you've already negotiated with him, let's leave it for now." Dumbledore breathed out in relief. Lynn sighed, inwardly cursing Dumbledore's ancestors for interrupting a 5th year's break. Over the next few days, Lynn learned exactly what Dumbledore meant by "my authority." It was as if a seal had been broken. Umbridge resumed her role as the Ministry's High Inquisitor and did so openly. Lynn didn't stop her. First, she hadn't actually assaulted any teachers or students. He couldn't go around attacking someone for being present while observing class. That would make him a bully, and despite everything, he still had a shred of decency. Second, Dumbledore had agreed to it. At dinner that evening, Umbridge rose and announced, "According to Educational Decree Number 23, the High Inquisitor of the Ministry has the right to inspect the teaching activities of all Hogwarts teachers. I hope all teachers will cooperate with my work." She looked to Dumbledore. He sat at the center of the staff table, cup of tea in hand. He set the cup down, met her gaze, and nodded. "Very well," he said. His voice was soft, but the great hall heard it plainly. Lynn's mind raced. It was as if both parties were consenting, one eager to give power, the other eager to exercise it. From that day on, Umbridge stopped sneaking around. She did everything in the open. Every day, she was either observing a class or on her way to one. She sat stiffly in the back row with a clipboard on her knees, silent except for the constant scratch of her quill. The sound lasted from the start of class to its end, and no one knew what she was writing. The next day, the Daily Prophet always ran an article, not on the front page, but a noticeable placement. The headlines varied, but the tone was the same. A certain teacher had committed serious pedagogical errors, a certain subject's content did not meet ministry standards, or a certain teacher's answers were vague and lacked professional quality. Each piece gave minute details, specific classroom examples, dates and times, even quoted dialogue. They read as well-reasoned and factual, hard to argue with. And because the incidents Umbridge cited were real, she had the facts on her side. For instance, Professor Flitwick taught an outdated charm in charms that really was out of date. He'd taught it because it was important to the syllabus and planned to introduce the modern alternative the following lesson. Umbridge's notes didn't include that follow-up. They recorded only the one class. Professor Sprout had students handle a somewhat dangerous plant in herbology. One student nicked a finger. The injury was minor and healed with a bit of dittany. Umbridge's report read, "The teacher permitted students to perform dangerous procedures despite known safety risks, resulting in injury to a student." Even Professor Binns's history of magic was criticized. His classes lacked interaction, and most students were in a state of slumber, making teaching effectiveness doubtful. It was an odd attack. You couldn't expect an unpaid ghost to be dynamic, but the article made it sound damning. Trelawney's divination class was easy pickings. Her lectures were obscure and mystical enough that Umbridge could note several pedagogical issues without much effort. The most absurd part was that Umbridge didn't spare her own class. The paper said her interpretation of the textbook was superficial, her classroom interaction was seriously insufficient, and she lacked patience with student questions. The articles had no byline, but everyone knew where the material came from. Lynn read the pieces in stunned silence. She knew her own teaching was mediocre, and yet she clung to the position and wielded it to attack others. Lynn's eyes narrowed and then lit up. He grinned. "Doesn't this give me reason to act?" he thought. He let out a soft, satisfied chuckle. Heh, heh, heh. Chapter 329, Trelawney's Prophecy. Thursday afternoon, Professor Trelawney's divination class was the last lesson of the day. Lynn, Edgar, and Ollie pushed open the trapdoor and climbed the ladder. A familiar, cloying scent drifted down and made Lynn frown. No matter how many times he came up here, he never got used to it. The classroom was the same as ever, a circular attic room with dark red curtains, small lamps with crimson shades, and dozens of candles of varying heights. But there was something different today. Each small table now held a considerable crystal ball. "Oh-ho," Lynn said, eyeing them. "Something new. Finally, we don't have to make things up over teacups." Edgar grinned and nudged him as they walked. "Not necessarily. What if crystal ball visions are even harder to invent than tea leaves?" "When do you ever not make things up?" Lynn shot back. "That's my talent," Edgar said, puffing up. "Professor Trelawney says prophecy requires spiritual perception, not rote memorization. She tells everyone that." Edgar blinked, offended. "Mind your own business." They took their usual round table, humans are creatures of habit, and put their books down. Students gradually filled the room. Hufflepuff and Slytherin took up opposite sides, as they always did, though there was overlap. Sitting across from Lynn was Draco Malfoy. They'd kept that arrangement since their first divination class in third year. The bell rang on time. The trapdoor opened, and Professor Trelawney entered, followed by Dolores Umbridge. Trelawney paused at the podium and did not so much as glance at Umbridge sitting at the back. She adjusted her shawl, smoothed the peacock feather in her hair, and spread her arms wide. "Welcome, children. Welcome to the Observatory of Fate, this hall for peering through the veils of time." Her gaze swept the faces in the room. After much study, those of you with the gift, those chosen by fate, have at last stepped into the ranks of the near seers. Her voice rose, cultivated for drama. But this step is one many cannot cross in a lifetime. How many never move from mere sight to true foresight? How many spend their lives seeing only their reflections in the mists of a crystal ball rather than the patterns of fate? She walked to the side of the podium and picked up a crystal ball. "Today," she murmured, returning to her ethereal tone, "I shall lead you in attempting that step." She held the sphere up, peering through it at them. "Place your hands on the crystal ball." Her voice took on solemnity. "I can hardly wait to witness the birth of a new seer. The curtain of fate is about to be drawn back, and the river of time will flow before your eyes. Who shall be the chosen child? Who shall be the first to hear the whispers of destiny? Let us wait and see." Before she finished, Edgar had already slammed his palm on the crystal ball. As expected, nothing happened. He sighed. "I knew it," he muttered and pushed the ball toward Ollie. Ollie pushed his to Lynn with an expressionless shrug. Just as Lynn reached for it, he noticed Draco watching expectantly across the table. "How about you go first?" he said, nudging the ball slightly forward. Draco leaned in, then pulled back. "No, you go first." Why be so polite? Lynn pushed the ball again. Come on. Malfoy pushed it back. I said you first. You first. You first. They nudged the ball back and forth until Lynn, losing patience, applied a little too much force. The ball rolled faster this time, past Draco's fingers, and slid off the edge of the table. Hey! Lynn's reflexes kicked in. He caught the ball before it hit the floor. Ah! Though the crystal ball remained intact, Trelawney let out a high, piercing shriek. The entire classroom turned toward the podium. Trelawney stood with one hand to her chest and the other pointing at the table. The crystal ball, she cried. How dare you? How dare you treat the vessel of fate so? She strode forward, snatched the ball, and clutched it to her breast. The gift of prophecy has not chosen you. She glared first at Lynn, then at Draco, disappointment heavy in her voice. The doors of fate have not opened for you. You have desecrated this sacred object. Shaking her head, she murmured words like talent, fate, and pity as she hurried toward the row of cabinets at the back of the room. Without waiting for permission, she thrust the crystal ball into Umbridge's hands. When she opened the cabinet door, she stopped dead. Her hand froze in midair, fingertips inches from the crystal ball. She stared at Umbridge as if her soul had been wrenched from her body. Her lips began to twitch, opening and closing with no sound. The classroom fell silent. Is she going to say she sees nothing again? Edgar whispered, remembering the time Trelawney had fainted back in third year. This time, however, Trelawney did not fake it. In a drifting, unsteady voice, she spoke a true, unexpected prophecy. The toad that crawls in the shadow of power, beneath its skin hides a darkness that refuses to sleep. When the flames of chaos descend with purifying power, the toad shall shed its hideous shell in the burning, and that darkness will be like a shadow severed by a sharp blade. Her words trailed. Residing in, she never finished. Her eyes rolled back and all strength left her. She fell backward with a dull thump. She had fainted. What did she mean by that? A toad? What toad? Murmured voices rose. Umbridge sprang to her feet, her chair legs scraping. This class is over. Everyone out. Now! She hurried out of the trapdoor without waiting for the students to leave. Trelawney's prophecy spread through Hogwarts like exploding caltrops. Before the divination class had even finished dispersing, the story, Trelawney fainted after prophesying about Umbridge, was already racing down corridors. By the time Lynn and his friends left, every corner of the castle knew. The versions multiplied wildly. Some claimed Trelawney had seen a bloody disaster in Umbridge's future. Others said she cursed Umbridge to a miserable death. One rumor joked that Hogwarts would be renamed Umbridge Memorial School. By nightfall, there was even a rumor that Trelawney was a Death Eater spy who used prophecies to assassinate high-ranking ministry officials. Lynn laughed over dinner when he heard that one and nearly sprayed pumpkin juice. Most students reacted to the news with one emotion, delighted glee. It wasn't because they thought well of Trelawney. Most saw her as a harmless fraud whose classes revolved around tea-leaf interpretation and vague nonsense. It was Umbridge they hated. Her mere presence was a provocation, and now someone had pointed and said, "This thorn will rot soon." The first reaction was not, "Is it true?" but "Great. When?" The corridors changed. Where students used to hurry past Umbridge with heads down, now they slowed, listening for any sign she might suddenly scream and drop dead. Umbridge was probably the first person in Hogwarts history whom the entire school secretly wished ill upon. Peeves took to adapting nursery rhymes with words like toad and chard, chasing Umbridge through the halls and cackling. Filch chased after him for 3 corridors and, in the end, got smacked in the head with a bag of flour and ended up white from crown to boots. A minority of students, though, were skeptical. They were the ones who had been prophesied misfortunes in Trelawney's class. Neville Longbottom, for example, had been told once that he would break a pink teacup. He did break a teacup the next day, but it was white and belonged to Professor McGonagall. Those students knew Trelawney's pronouncements often sounded more like random guesses than glimpses of destiny. To them, Trelawney had probably blurted something to scare Umbridge and avoid being sacked. She'd fainted before, and might have done so again. Still, everyone wanted to know how it would end. The most direct sign of that curiosity was the sudden crowds outside the Defense Against the Dark Arts office. For most of the term, that corridor had been quiet. After the prophecy, it became a landmark. Lynn heard that if you passed that way, you could hear smashing and cursing from inside. In this school-wide carnival, two people did particularly well: Fred and George Weasley. The twins had always had a knack for finding a market. What did students want now? To hear more clearly. To know what was happening behind Umbridge's closed door without getting caught. The Weasleys had just the thing: extendable ears. They'd invented them before, but never mass-produced them because they were too niche, until now. That evening, they set up a small stall in the Gryffindor common room. "Extendable ears," Fred announced, holding one up. "Hear it clearer than you ever could. Walls have ears, doors have ears too. Magic amplified, high-fidelity sound with noise filtering. You can even tell what brand of cup is being smashed by the crack." George added, "Limited supply. First come, first served. 1 galleon for 2, 2 galleons for 3. "Why 2 galleons for 3? Someone asked. "Because we're unscrupulous businessmen," George said, grinning. The pile of extendable ears vanished within half an hour. A new sight became common in the fourth-floor corridor: small groups skulking outside Umbridge's office, clutching long golden wires in eager hands, passing the tips through keyholes and under doors, whispering fiercely about what they'd heard. "She's cursing again." "Cursing who?" "Can't hear clearly. Sounds like that old woman." "Old woman? Trelawney?" "Probably. She also said something like, 'I'll make her regret it.'" Tsk, tsk. Chapter 330. The Difference Between People. Saturdays at Hogwarts always carried a slightly lazier air. Lynn leaned against the back of the Hufflepuff table, a half-eaten piece of toast in his hand, and watched the Gryffindor table. More precisely, Harry Potter, who was speaking beside it. "You know who is back, and his Death Eaters are surely planning against Dumbledore," Harry said. "But even with everything going on, we're learning nothing in defense against the dark arts." Lynn took another bite and nodded inwardly. Harry had a point. Defense against the dark arts had been a disaster for years. Quirrell stuttered through the first year. Lockhart taught nothing in the second. Lupin in the third had at least covered basic dark creatures, and last year, Moody had taught something about dealing with people. But could you expect a student with barely 2 years of serious study under his belt to handle vicious Death Eaters? Lynn sighed. "Might as well sleep early." A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Lynn, excuse me?" Hermione had slipped over from the Gryffindor table, Harry and Ron following. "What is it?" Lynn asked. Hermione glanced around, eyes sweeping over the Hufflepuffs and a group of passing Ravenclaw girls. She lowered her voice. "There are too many people here. Can we go somewhere quiet?" Lynn didn't get up. He slid his wand from his sleeve and tapped it lightly. "Muffliato." A faint shimmer radiated from the wand tip like a ripple and hung in the air, solidifying into a nearly invisible barrier around the four of them. Lynn slipped his wand back into his sleeve. "There. No one can hear us now." Hermione's eyes lit up. "So that's how it works." Her whisper rose into normal speech and then into excitement. "Can you teach me that spell?" "Of course," Lynn said. "That's great. When—" Ahem! A dry cough cut across them. Hermione froze, instantly bright red. "Oh, sorry. I came to ask you something else." Lynn shrugged and gestured for her to continue. Hermione took a breath, organizing herself. "You know how terrible Umbridge is. We can't learn defense from her at all. In class, she just makes us read the textbook. After that, we just sit and stare at it until the bell. She won't teach spells, won't demonstrate, won't let us practice. Her voice tightened. She won't let students ask questions. When I asked why we couldn't learn Expelliarmus, she said, 'Miss Granger, anything not in the textbook is not on the exam,' and then docked me 5 points for speaking without permission." Hermione rarely criticized a teacher like that. She revered knowledge and respected those who taught it. Umbridge was the first professor who made her feel the instructor had no right to stand at the podium. Lynn listened quietly for a moment. "First, a disclaimer," he said. "If you want to band together and drive Umbridge out—" He paused. "That's unlikely." Harry and Ron both opened their mouths, but Lynn didn't wait. "She has Dumbledore backing her." All three looked at him in shock. They assumed he'd misspoken and meant the Ministry of Magic. Who would think Dumbledore supported Umbridge? Hermione said quickly, afraid of being cut off. "No, I know we can't oust her. I was thinking—" Maybe we could set up our own class. Lynn sat up. You mean organize lessons yourselves? Hermione nodded eagerly. We need a teacher, someone who'll demonstrate spells and correct us, someone like Moody. Hermione kept glancing at Lynn as she talked, growing more excited. We have a person right here. He's more suited to this than almost anyone at Hogwarts. Harry and Ron encouraged her. If they hadn't made their meaning clear yet, they did now. Lynn leaned back, crossed his legs, and regarded Hermione with a look that said he understood. I support the idea, he said sincerely. It's a good plan. Hermione brightened. So you agree? Yes, Lynn stood. I'll go find Cedric now. You three stay put. He turned to leave before they could react, ready to take initiative. Hermione's hand shot out and grabbed his shoulder, halting him. Lynn stopped mid-step and turned to look at her. Hermione's face flushed deeper, a mixture of embarrassment and determination in her voice. Actually, she said through gritted teeth, we wanted to ask you. Lynn sighed, stepped back, and sat down again. Why me? Hermione let go and spoke calmly, as if reading from a resume. All your honors are in the trophy room, several special awards for services to the school. The youngest recipient of the Order of Merlin, 3rd class. The youngest recipient of the Order of Merlin, 1st class. And your performance in the Triwizard Tournament, driving off a Norwegian ridgeback by yourself, fighting a blue-ring giant demon octopus alone at the bottom of the Black Lake, and handling multiple champions under Imperius at the maze entrance. She paused for effect. If you aren't suitable, there's no one suitable at Hogwarts. Ron, unconvinced, blurted, No, you're not suitable. Lynn's expression didn't change. There's a difference between being able to pass on what you know and knowing what it's like to struggle to learn. Ron's face burned. He had worked for days with Hermione just to get simple spells to passable levels. The harder charms, like the Patronus, he still hadn't managed. He had always comforted himself with, he's a genius, I'm ordinary. Now Lynn's words stung more. Not genius, simply never having experienced the difficulty of learning. It made the gap feel like a gulf. Ron had nothing to say. Lynn looked at Hermione. I can demonstrate almost any spell at a glance. I've never had to learn through failure and repetition the way you have. So I can't explain the process. I don't know it. Even if I could teach, it would be mostly practical combat training. He flicked his wand and lifted the muffliato. And I doubt many of you could handle that. He reached over and patted Edgar, who was chewing a roast lamb chop beside him. Edgar, mid-bite, reacted instantly. Fork clattered, chop abandoned. He leapt up so fast William startled. My broom! I forgot my broom on the pitch, he blurted, and ran off before he finished. William and Ollie didn't bother with excuses. They bolted too. Lynn looked back at Hermione, Harry, and Ron. They were staring after the three who fled with looks that mixed awe and apprehension. Whatever training rumor had made those boys so jumpy, Lynn kept his hands spread in a helpless gesture. See? No one spoke. Lynn leaned back with his hands behind his head. I'll help persuade Cedric, he said. He seems to have more free time these days. Okay, Hermione said. Lynn nodded and rose. I'll go find him. Eat. I'll let you know if I have any news. Chapter 331. Dizzy from being overwhelmed by money. The Quidditch pitch lay mottled in afternoon sunlight as clouds drifted by, throwing moving patches of light over the grass. The stands were mostly empty. There wasn't an official match today, so only a few students lingered in small groups, some with binoculars, watching whatever caught their interest. On the pitch, however, two teams were mid-practice, Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw, and the players, resplendent in their house colors, flashed back and forth so quickly it made the head spin. Lynn sat at the highest point in the stands for the best view of the whole field, though he hadn't come to watch Quidditch much out of love for the game. He'd come looking for someone. He scanned the pitch until he found Cedric. Even when the golden snitch zipped past nearby, Cedric didn't react. His gaze was fixed on the far side of the field. What are you looking at? Lynn muttered, following Cedric's line of sight. Across half the pitch, two seekers were staring at one another. Who watches an opponent instead of the ball, the snitch, their teammates, or the score? Lynn almost wanted to sprint down and shout, Are you here to play or to go on a date? The match continued. Hufflepuff held a narrow lead of 30 points, but Ravenclaw's chasers were showing smoother coordination. Lynn noticed Cho's expression shift. Her gaze slid away from Cedric and began to sweep the pitch, drifting toward the center. Cedric's broom followed her line of sight by half a meter and then stopped, his face threaded with disappointment. Lynn nearly laughed. He could write a paper now, attention allocation and romantic distraction in Quidditch matches. Cho's flying was actually impressive. Her form was steady, her turns fluid, her speed respectable. She was just a hair behind Cedric. Then Cho suddenly accelerated, leaning low and cutting toward the right like an arrow. The snitch darted close to the ground. Cho chased it so tightly, Lynn thought she might collide with the railing of the stands. Cedric moved, only because he'd been watching Cho again and hadn't noticed the snitch until the last second. By the time he gave chase, Cho already had several body lengths on him. But Cedric's broom was faster. Lynn had modified it, and its acceleration outpaced any mass-produced model. Cedric shoved down on the handle and seemed to launch forward, slicing through the air with a whistle. The gap closed. One body, half a body, a shoulder. Both hands reached for that golden flash. The match was decided. Lynn stood and walked down the stands. By the edge of the pitch, the Hufflepuff players had gathered in a loose circle for a post-match debrief. Cedric stood in the middle, still holding the snitch, talking quietly. Lynn reached the circle and tapped Cedric on the shoulder. Cedric turned, startled when he recognized him. "Lynn, what are you doing here? Decided to try out for Hufflepuff? I need to talk to you." Lynn glanced at the curious players nearby who had eavesdropped, then lowered his voice. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Cedric nodded, handed the snitch to Edgar, and followed Lynn to a large tree at the pitch's edge. "What's up?" he asked. Lynn got straight to the point. He explained Hermione and the others' plan, what Harry had suggested, the mess with Umbridge's teaching, and the group's need for someone to run the Defense Against the Dark Arts extracurricular practice sessions. Cedric listened and was speechless. "Huh?" His eyes widened. "Me? Be a professor?" Lynn nodded, praise coming easily. "Your grades are always at the top. You pick up spells the moment they're taught. You're straight O's across the board, and your spell work is flawless, both in practice and theory." Cedric's mouth twitched into a small smile. "Sounds like you're flattering me," he said, amusement in his voice. "But I won't lie, it does motivate me." "Don't worry about the details," Lynn said with a wave. "So, do you agree?" Cedric hesitated a beat and then nodded. "If they'll listen, I don't mind." Lynn clapped a hand to his shoulder. "I knew I could count on you. Then it's settled, Professor Cedric." Cedric shook his head, smiling helplessly. "I'm not qualified to be a professor. If Cho called you that, you wouldn't think so." His face went bright red at the thought. Lynn nearly crowed, but the click of a camera shutter cut through the moment. Cedric glanced up. Lynn was holding his camera. The lens was pointed at Cedric, and a newly taken photo glowed on the screen. "I'll sell this picture to Cho," Lynn said, turning the camera so Cedric could see. "She'll love it." He slipped the camera into his pocket, then bent down, grabbed Cedric's unlocked broom, straddled it, and kicked off. "Lynn, I'll help you check the lesson plans. You're welcome." Back in the Great Hall 2 weeks later, the Weasley twins had not let the Professor Cedric joke drop. Fred and George had taken to greeting him with mock reverence every day since Lynn had pushed the teaching responsibility, willingly or not, onto Cedric. At first, Cedric blushed and protested. "I'm not a professor." 2 weeks in, the jokes had become routine, and nothing he said changed it. This morning, however, when Fred and George approached him again, careful to keep their voices down because it was Hogsmeade weekend, Cedric's scalp still prickled. "Good morning, Fred." "George," he said weakly. "Good morning, Professor Cedric," the twins chimed. Cedric's temple throbbed. Lynn, who had been the one to find Cedric the role, felt a twinge of sympathy and cut in. "Ahem, Cedric, what are you planning to buy in Hogsmeade today?" Fred and George exchanged a glance, and for once held back their mischief. Cedric flashed Lynn a grateful look, dug into his pocket, and produced a small folded sheet of parchment. It was densely covered in numbers. Lynn leaned closer. It wasn't a lesson plan or syllabus, just rows of figures. "This is?" Lynn asked. "We plan to have a batch of robes made for club members," Cedric said, tapping the parchment, "to wear during meetings. We can't have everyone sitting around in different house robes. It'd look like house rivalry." Lynn stared at the page of figures and then at Cedric. "Are you footing the bill for that?" he asked. Even ordering cheap custom robes would cost a fair number of galleons. Cedric's family was well off, but not to the point of casually paying for an entire club's uniforms. Cedric gave a rueful smile. "Not me. Some Slytherins wanted to join the club a while back, and Ron refused outright." Lynn raised an eyebrow. Ron's reluctance to let Slytherins join wasn't surprising. "So what's that got to do with robes?" "Those Slytherins launched a financial offensive," Cedric said dryly. "They donated a large sum to the club as activity funds." Lynn blinked at the phrasing and the logic. If Ron wouldn't agree to let those Slytherins in, the Slytherins simply made themselves indispensable by flooding the club with money. You can't very well reject someone and also take their donation without looking bad. Ron, stubborn but not shameless, hadn't explicitly agreed, Cedric said, but he'd stopped opposing it. They walked toward Hogsmeade along paths already busy with students in groups, laughing and chatting. Fred and George had planned to look into renting a shopfront, one with a perfect location and suspiciously low rent, until they suddenly changed course. "Let's check the robes first," Fred said. "Right, we need to inspect fabric, colors, and prices," George added, eager. "What if the tailor has a discount?" Cedric only glanced at the twins, knowing all too well what their real interest was, how lavishly the Slytherins had spent their money. Lynn didn't care either way. They changed direction and headed into Gladrag's wizardwear. The bell chimed as the door opened, and a warm blend of lavender and new fabric wrapped around them. A few customers were already inside, 2 Slytherin girls and Draco Malfoy. Lynn recognized the pair, Daphne Greengrass, a 5th year, and her younger sister Astoria in 3rd year. The 3 turned toward the entrance as they came in. "Good morning," Cedric greeted politely. "Good morning, Lynn." "Cedric," Draco acknowledged. Daphne gave a small, polite nod. Astoria, more enthusiastic, beamed at Cedric. "Good morning, Professor Cedric and Lynn." The Weasley twins, ever conspicuous, chose to ignore them, mainly out of instinctive uncertainty about how to deal with Malfoy and company. They nevertheless bounded through the shop, picking up expensive-looking robes and admiring the cut and fabric with clicks of approval. The assistant asked if they were buying. Fred and George pretended solemn consideration and hung the robes back up. The assistant barely blinked, regular theater in a clothes shop. Cedric browsed the display cases, his eye catching on brooches. Daphne and Astoria were still perusing samples. Astoria held a small silver snake brooch to her sister's chest and then passed it along. Cedric watched them for a while before leaning toward Lynn. "Those are the Slytherins who made the donation," he said in a low voice. Lynn glanced at the girls and then back at Cedric. "They have good taste," he observed. "At least they spent the money properly." Cedric smiled and said nothing. Lynn tapped the idea of adding a club badge. "How about a logo, like a Quidditch team, embroidered on the chest so everyone knows which club they're in?" Cedric's eyes brightened. "That's a good idea." "Then you're in charge of the design," Lynn said, patting his shoulder in mock solemnity. "Since you're the professor, you get the final say." Cedric gave a helpless look. "I'm not a professor," he protested weakly. He sighed, folded the parchment back into his pocket, and headed to the rack of fabric samples to start choosing colors. About 2 hours later, the shop owner personally saw them to the door. The gray-haired tailor, gold-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, stood under the porch with his hands folded in front of him, bowing so low his waist was almost 90 degrees. His eyes were narrowed to slits, and the corners of his mouth stretched into a grin that threatened to split his face. "Just as we discussed. Deliver them to Hogwarts tomorrow, no problem?" Draco said from the steps, one hand in his pocket, the other relaxed at his side. "No problem, no problem," the shop owner replied, nodding so eagerly he seemed afraid Draco might change his mind. "I will definitely deliver the robes on time. You can rest assured, Mr. Malfoy. Gladrag's wizardwear has a reputation. I will personally oversee the fabric, the workmanship, and the embroidery of every single piece. I absolutely won't let you down." His voice rushed on as if speed could secure the promise. An order this large was the sort of thing he might see only once in years. Although Gladrag's was well known, it mostly served individual customers. Students coming in for school robes one day, a customer buying a traveling cloak the next, a couple ordering wedding robes the day after. Orders for dozens of robes at once were rare. The owner wanted nothing more than to please them. Let alone delivering tomorrow, he would have agreed to deliver tonight and worked through the night if asked. At worst, he'd push back other customers' orders. Very well. Draco nodded, his gaze resting briefly on Lynn. Then we'll head back first, Lynn. Lynn waved as they left, watching their backs until they turned the corner. His thoughts drifted to another person, Draco's father, Lucius Malfoy. Since Lynn had last sent Lucius Lord Voldemort's location, Lucius hadn't replied. Lynn flicked through his call log. The last contact had been months ago. If Draco hadn't still been attending school normally, Lynn would have suspected Lucius was dead. Nearby, Cedric watched the three Slytherins go, then pulled his phone from his pocket to check the time. He frowned. Sorry, Lynn. Fred, George. He put his phone away and looked up, apologetic. I don't think I can come with you to rent the shop. The team has a practice match. Lynn glanced over. It isn't against Ravenclaw again, is it? Cedric's eyes darted about, left, right, up at the sky, anywhere but at Lynn. Lynn understood without an answer. Sk. He had barely started the first syllable before Cedric ran off. As long as I can't hear it, Lynn isn't mocking me, he muttered. 5 minutes later, Lynn followed the twins to the front of a small shop. It wasn't on the main street, but its position in an alley only a few dozen paces away was decent enough. The rent was cheap. The door was dark wood, scored with shallow scratches from moving things in and out. A faded sign above the frame barely showed the words XX Shop. Fred and George stood at the entrance, solemn. Lynn pushed the door and followed them inside. The shop wasn't huge, but it had a rectangular floor space big enough for a dozen display cases and a counter. A door further in led to a small warehouse or office, and beyond that one could see a tiny courtyard with a single bare tree reaching its branches toward the sky. Lynn's mind went straight to numbers. Display cases here, a counter there, samples on the walls. Joke shop items were small. They didn't need much display space. More important, the location was close to the main street, near Honeyduke's and the Three Broomsticks, so foot traffic was guaranteed. A voice called from behind the inner door. Coming, hurried footsteps, and then a middle-aged man emerged. He looked about Lucius's age in the 40s, but shorter and rounder. His eyes were small. His gaze swept over the trio and stopped on Fred. Mr. Weasley, he asked. That's me, Fred said. The owner's smile widened. He stepped forward and grasped Fred's hand. So? He spoke fast and urgent. My place is high quality and low price, isn't it? I told you the Main Street shops are a ripoff. Ridiculous rents, and for what? Not even a better location. He inhaled, seemed to steel himself, and added, If you've decided, we can sign the contract right now. Lynn raised an eyebrow and took a step aside, pretending to inspect a crack in the wall. His fingers brushed the wand tucked in his robe, a reflexive check. Something about the owner's eagerness felt off. He scanned the shop, walls, floor, ceiling, the door to the courtyard, looking for traces of hexes or lingering curses, but there were none. Just an ordinary, slightly shabby shop in a decent spot. Lynn decided to wait and see. Fred didn't take the bait. No rush, we think the price can be negotiated. The shop owner's smile froze. That's still too low, he protested. I've already dropped it to 80% of market price. 80%! Go ask around. What shop in Hogsmeade would give you this? George, calm as ever, said, not very loud but clearly for the owner's benefit. Wouldn't it be better to keep this money as pocket money? Why do we have to open a shop? Fred faltered. That's true, he said, hesitating, but then added, Opening a shop's been my dream since I was little. Dreams have to be realistic, George replied, spreading his hands. The money we have is only enough to cover 80%. The owner's teeth ground together. If he hadn't realized the twins were putting on a show, he'd wasted his life. Still, he needed the rent paid quickly. With a forced breath, he conceded, 80% it is. It can't go any lower. Fred and George exchanged a look and said in unison, Sign the contract. The owner produced a parchment from under the counter and spread it on the table. Fred picked up the quill and read through, then passed it to George. George read and nodded. They took turns signing. The owner signed his name, took a seal from a drawer, and stamped the parchment. When the seal landed, a faint golden light shimmered over the contract. The binding enchantment had taken effect. Fred folded the contract and tucked it into his pocket. George placed a small cloth bag on the counter. The owner opened it, looked, and nodded. "The shop's yours now. I'm leaving." Without waiting for reaction, he hurried away. The three of them stood in stunned silence. Then a crisp notification sounded from Lynn's phone. Fred and George both turned to him. Lynn pulled his phone out. It was a new message. "Message from your friend, Platinum Gentleman, Lucius." He opened it. "Several Death Eaters have gone to Hogsmeade to find Karkaroff." A location link was attached below. Lynn tapped it. The place looked familiar. "Wait, isn't this?" he began, but a scream cut him off. "Ah!" A piercing cry came from outside. "Help! It's the Death Eaters. You know who really is back. Quick, call the Aurors. There's no time. Just run. Someone help me." Lynn stood at the doorway, staring at the dark green flare of panic in the sky for a beat, then turned to Fred and George. "You two go back and tell Professor McGonagall. Tell her to strengthen the castle's security." "What about you?" Fred asked. Lynn didn't answer. He shoved his phone into his pocket, drew his wand from his sleeve, and gripped it. "I'm going to kill that bastard." Without waiting for anyone to stop him, he pushed off with both feet and shot into the sky. 333, Chapter 333, Don't You Hibernate. Lynn arrived above the street, where the Death Eaters had gathered in the blink of an eye. The wind ripped at his robes until they snapped loudly in his ears. Below, a swarm of small black figures hurried through the thoroughfares. Thankfully, they were not Death Eaters, but fleeing wizards, likely students or weekend tourists from Hogsmeade. He didn't bother with them. His attention fixed on the 6 black-robed figures standing in the center of the road. Their hoods were pulled low, faces shadowed, curses leapt from their wands, tearing at the shop fronts. Beside them, bound and trussed, someone sat slumped. Karkaroff? Lynn studied the captive with a quick, thorough glance. This build, that face, this was the shop owner who had rented the place to Fred and George. Of course, no wonder he'd been so eager to hand the shop over. He'd been trying to get away. Lynn shook his head, raised his wand, and aimed. He condensed an irrumpent projection and sent it downward. A deafening, animalistic roar ripped through the sky, so loud the windows along the street vibrated and the few fleeing people instinctively covered their ears. The Death Eaters froze and looked up to see a massive beast hurtling down, sparks and bluish lightning trailing from its hooves. Lynn had woven lightning into the projection. Arcs of blue-white stitched the air with each step, curses coating its gray-purple hide like an invisible film. It dove so fast, the air itself seemed to tear. The erumpent struck the pavement with the force of a meteor. Stone slabs shattered, gravel and dust exploded outward. A jagged, person-deep hole appeared where the projection's head had buried itself, still boring downward. The Death Eaters laughed as they closed in, mocking the struggling creature. "Ha ha ha ha! What a stupid thing!" one crowed. "It hit the ground. What's the point?" Their laughter died as the projection detonated. The explosion was instantaneous and massive, a blast many times louder than the original roar. Windows shattered, walls trembled, and a visible shockwave raced out from the pit. One Death Eater moved instinctively. The moment the projection began to glow, he dove sideways and thrust a shield charm up. The barrier took most of the force, but he was still hurled through the air and slammed into the opposite wall. His frame hit the stone with a sickening crack. He slid down into a heap, bones broken, robes soaked with blood. The shield had kept him alive, but barely. The others fared far worse. The loudest laugher was struck full by the wave before he could summon any protection. The blast tore him apart. Flesh and gore scattered across the street, his remains reduced to an unrecognizable ruin. The 2 or 3 others nearest the pit were thrown. Jagged cuts and scorched marks marred their skin, curses festering where lightning had kissed them. They lay twitching, near death. In seconds, Lynn had finished with them. He drifted down and landed at the rim of the crater. Karkaroff lay at the bottom, bound and pale, lips violet, breathing a thread. His robes had been torn by the blast. Flying debris had left bleeding cuts. Lynn had deliberately held back. The explosion had been powerful enough that a full blast at that range would have obliterated more than intended. He swept his wand and murmured, "White moss protection, silver glow circulation." A soft, silvery light blossomed at the tip and flowed over Karkaroff like water into parched earth. Wounds eased shut, the pallor faded to a healthier pink, and his breathing steadied from shallow and failing to faintly regular. Lynn felt a flicker of something like distaste at himself. His first time using those two charms to save someone. And of all people, it was Karkaroff. He straightened, brushed dust from his robes, and turned to sort the surviving Death Eaters for transport back to Hogwarts. He had barely taken a step when a faint metallic click sounded behind him. The noise was so slight, he might have missed it if his hearing weren't keener than most. Click. Another, clearer this time, came from above him. Lynn turned. A beetle circled in midair, buzzing. Hogsmeade in November, cold, damp, the Highlands chill set in. Beetles should be in hibernation by now. Most vanish by October. If one was flying outside in November, it had to be driven from its lair, or it wasn't a beetle at all. His wand flicked. He aimed and whispered, "Accio!" An invisible tug seized the insect and pulled it straight into his palm before it could react. Its legs scrambled between his fingers. Its wings beat wildly beneath the shell. Lynn held it up to his face and watched it struggle. "You little punk," he said, not loudly. "It's almost November. Don't you hibernate?" The beetle thrashed even harder, but to no avail. Lynn took a small glass bottle from his pocket, a palm-sized vial stopped with a cork, dropped the insect inside, and corked it. The beetle fluttered frantically against the glass, wings rasping, then slowly subsided to the bottom as if resigned. Lynn peered at the tiny creature in the glass. "Don't be afraid," he told it. "I won't kill you, at least not yet." It stirred again. He smiled a little, slipped the bottle back into his pocket, and returned to the task at hand. For those still breathing, he cast Stupefy to keep them unconscious during transport. He pried the man slammed into the wall loose and stunned him as well. Lynn gathered the wounded, conjured several ropes with a transfiguration twist, bound them together in a line, and floated them in front of him like a string of sacks. He brought the scattered remains over to the foot of the pit, flicked his wand, and sent a controlled burst of fiendfire to consume the shredded corpse. The flame burned everything clean, no ash, no trace. Satisfied, Lynn checked his pocket watch. It was still early. He thought for a beat and decided not to call Wu on. The distance wasn't far, and he could haul them himself. He looped a hand through the conjured ropes, his prisoners levitating beside him like a grotesque parade, and began to walk toward Hogwarts. 334, Chapter 334. When did you develop a hobby? Walking back to Hogwarts, Lynn's appearance was impossible to ignore. He strode ahead with one hand in his pocket and the other holding his wand. The tip trailed behind him like a leash, dragging a line of unconscious Death Eaters. The path wasn't crowded, but every passerby who caught sight of him reacted spectacularly. Some stared in stunned silence, some tried to keep their composure, and a few looked utterly bewildered. Lynn, behind you. Are they people?" a girl stammered. Lynn stopped and glanced at her. "Those aren't people," he said flatly. "They're Death Eaters." The girl's face went pale, and she ran off without another word. Lynn watched her disappear and shook his head. He'd hoped at least one or two would cry. Have people's nerves gotten that steel hard now? Before he could move on, a sheet of red flame erupted ahead of him. Fawkes sailed out of the blaze, and Dumbledore stood beside the phoenix with one hand on the bird's back and the other holding his wand. He looked perfectly calm, not in the least surprised by Lynn's spectacle. "Mr. Lynn, you've returned." Lynn met his gaze but didn't answer. Dumbledore glanced at the trail of unconscious Death Eaters, then back at Lynn. "You brought them back?" he asked. "Brought them back," Lynn replied. Dumbledore was silent for a moment, then reached out and gripped Lynn's shoulder. "Let's go," he said. "We'll talk when we get back." Fawkes cried once, splendid and clear, spread his wings, and the light flared again. The glow wrapped Lynn, Dumbledore, and the long string of unconscious Death Eaters, and then everything vanished. Headmaster's office. Lynn sat opposite Dumbledore and gave a rapid account of what had happened in Hogsmeade. He'd arrived, found the Death Eaters, dealt with them, saved Karkaroff, and dragged them back. That was the whole story. Dumbledore listened without interrupting, then sat and thought for a long time. Lynn crossed his legs in his chair and watched the old man's pensive face. Only one thought occupied him. When can I go? Lately, every meeting with this stubborn headmaster had been the same. Child, power cannot solve everything. Child, you should be gentler. Child, compromise is sometimes necessary. He was tired of the same platitudes. It took effort not to yank the man's beard in the headmaster's office. Finally, Dumbledore looked up. The Ministry of Magic. Headmaster, Lynn cut in, standing and straightening his robes. If that's all, I'll be going. Don't worry about those Death Eaters. Have someone collect them. Karkaroff's there, probably still alive. Dumbledore opened his mouth, then closed it. Good night, said Lynn and left. He walked fast. Dumbledore managed only Lynn before the office door swung shut. Hufflepuff dormitory. Lynn pushed the dorm door open. Edgar lay on his bed, staring blankly at a Quidditch magazine, fixated on a team recruitment ad. William and Ollie sat at their desks, bent over their homework. All three looked up together when Lynn entered. He didn't greet them. He went straight to his desk, sat, and pulled a glass bottle from his pocket. Under the lamp, the bottle gleamed. At its bottom, a small beetle was curled into a ball, 6 legs tucked against its sides, wings folded under a shell, hardly moving. Only the faintest tremor in its wings suggested it was alive. Edgar poked his head up, saw the bottle, and his eyes lit. He hopped off the bed and hurried over, leaning close. Lynn, when did you pick up a hobby of keeping exotic pets? Lynn glanced up. Bah! Is that an exotic pet? Edgar asked again. Lynn shook the bottle. This is an animagus. At those words, William and Ollie put down their pens and came over. The three of them peered at the bottle like it was something priceless. Edgar's voice was skeptical. An animagus? Are you sure? A beetle? An animagus is a skill fewer than a dozen witches and wizards in Britain manage. Are you joking? Lynn didn't answer with more words. He acted. He pulled the cork. Ready for anything. He had his wand poised. If the beetle transformed and tried to flee, Lynn would make it regret it. The beetle stayed curled up at the bottom of the bottle, playing dead. Edgar frowned. Are you sure it's not just a regular beetle you caught to show off? Lynn's face darkened. He lifted his wand and aimed it at the beetle in the bottle. A small bolt of lightning leapt from the tip and struck the beetle's back with a crisp zapping sound. The beetle twitched violently. Its 6 legs flailed out, wings beat under the shell, buzzing weakly. It looked all but dead. Edgar watched with his mouth twitching. Is it still alive? Lynn didn't reply. He stared at the inert little thing, voice cold. Don't play dead with me. I'll count to 5. If you don't show yourself, I'll kill you. He started to count. 5. Rita Skeeter felt like dying. The shock had frozen her. 4, 3, 2. Just before Lynn reached the last number, the beetle forced itself to move and burst out of the bottle, transforming into human form. 1, Lynn finished. A crack of lightning hit as she completed her change. Rita convulsed and collapsed to the floor. Edgar, William, and Ollie stood over her with mouths hanging open in astonishment. It was true. An animagus. And the woman on the floor looked very familiar. Rita Skeeter, Edgar blurted. Lynn rubbed his ear, annoyed at the shout. All right, and watched Rita sprawl there, trembling. His voice was calm. I told you, right again and you're toast. Rita's body shook. She shrank inward as if she could disappear into the floorboards. A misunderstanding, she squeaked, voice thin with panic. It's all a misunderstanding. Mr. Lynn, it really is. Lynn waited. Rita gulped, forcing herself to collect herself. I just wanted to go shopping in Hogsmeade today. Her words came out in staccato, terrified bursts. Really, I only meant to pick up a few things and relax. I didn't expect to run into you, let alone those Death Eaters. I just saw an opportunity for a story, and I couldn't help. Her voice trailed off, smaller and weaker. She knew I couldn't help seeing something exciting, wouldn't cut it after being warned. But she had no other explanation. Nosiness was her trade. When a story appeared, she couldn't help herself. I didn't deliberately follow you to write, she added, trying to sound sincere. I swear I didn't. I was simply passing by. Then I saw you and got curious. Lynn interrupted. 2 words. Taking pictures. Rita's face flickered through expressions. I only wanted to photograph the wretched state those Death Eaters were in, she blurted. There isn't a single picture of you. Honestly, not one. You can check my camera. She fumbled a small silver camera from her robe and thrust it at him, hands trembling. The device was scored with scratches from long use. Lynn took it, examined it briefly, then looked into her eyes. His gaze felt invasive. He quietly used legilimency to scan her memories. After a moment, he withdrew his stare. Good. she still retained whatever memory he needed. "No need," he said, handing the camera back. Rita clutched the camera as if the world had tilted back into place. She took a shuddering breath, exhaled, and fixed Lynn with a fawning smile. "Since I've explained everything clearly," she tested. Then, her meaning was plain. She wanted to go. "You want to leave?" Lynn's tone was neutral, betraying nothing. Her relief blossomed. She nodded so hard her hair bobbed. Lynn watched her a little while longer, then said, "It's possible." Rita's eyes lit up. "Since you're already here and you've taken the photos," she said, voice brightening, "write an article before you go. The headline will be, 'Why is Fudge Hiding?'" Chapter 335. Oh, my dear business partner. The next day, Cornelius Fudge sat behind his spacious desk as usual, handling official business. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows and warmed a patch of the deep red Persian carpet at his feet. He had paid a fortune for that carpet the year he became minister. He liked its soft, resilient weave and the way visitors' eyes wandered to it when they entered. Today, though, he had no interest in carpets. He was in a foul temper. Several files lay splayed across his desk, but he could not focus on a single one. Part of his agitation came from yesterday's attack in Hogsmeade by dark wizards suspected of being Death Eaters. Since the afternoon, the Flu Network had been alive with anxious flames as pale-faced wizards tumbled out of fireplaces, shouting to reception staff. Something happened in Hogsmeade. Dark wizards. Several dark wizards. The news spread like wildfire. In less than an hour, the whole wizarding world knew. Hogsmeade had been attacked. Rumors multiplied. Death Eaters were to blame. You-know-who had returned. A gang of dark wizards was taking revenge. Versions varied, but the common thread was panic. The Auror office reacted quickly. Within 10 minutes of the report, the first wave of Aurors arrived in Hogsmeade by Flu, with more batches following. They cordoned off the streets, sealed the site with protective charms, interviewed witnesses, examined the scene, and arrested the unconscious dark wizards they found. By the time the Aurors reached Hogwarts, the captives had been tied together and were stacked in the headmaster's office. They were all out cold, their bodies bearing lightning burn marks, curse ulcers, and shockwave lacerations, even after Madame Pomfrey had treated them. The ministry's mailbag had nearly burst that morning, and Fudge nearly choked on his anger as he read the letters. Fortunately, those dark wizards had been captured and locked up in Azkaban. In terms of outcome, the incident was contained. The dark wizards were caught, the hostages rescued, and Hogsmeade's order restored. The process had not been pretty, but the result was acceptable. The trouble was, the numbers did not add up. Some witnesses reported 6 dark wizards and 1 kidnapped hostage. Yet the Aurors returned 6 individuals total, counting Karkaroff, treated as the hostage. The Aurors turned the scene upside down and even questioned Dumbledore, but 1 dark wizard seemed to have evaporated, vanished without a trace. When the head of the Auror office relayed this to Fudge, his tone was carefully neutral. "Minister," he said, "we suspect that dark wizard may have been, well, dealt with. There are traces of fiendfire residue at the scene, but the area was burned too cleanly for us to be certain." Fudge said nothing further. He told the head of the Auror office to word the report vaguely. The dark wizard may have been obliterated in the explosion. His life or death cannot be confirmed at present. None of that, however, was what was truly eating at him. The front page of today's Daily Prophet bore a piece titled, "Why Fudge Concealed the Ministry's Good Intentions," which filled the entire page and was penned under a dramatic pseudonym, Phoenix. It is reported that the reason Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, concealed the resurrection of you-know-who was for the stability of the wizarding world, the article began. According to the article, Fudge had chosen silence to avoid triggering panic. Death and chaos were exactly what the Death Eaters wanted. Minister Fudge chose to use silence as a weapon, concealment as a strategy, trading time for space. The ministry has always safeguarded people in unseen ways, it declared. The piece praised Aurors who pursued Death Eaters, investigators who fought in the shadows, and the Dementors who guarded prisoners at Azkaban. The Hogsmeade attack, the article argued, had been an unfortunate incident that was swiftly controlled thanks to prior ministry deployment. Had they not acted, the consequences would have been unimaginable. There was not a single disparaging line about the ministry. It was a hymn to Fudge's virtue, and that was precisely why it infuriated him. If he issued a rebuttal, he would be admitting the ministry's incompetence and open himself to charges of dereliction. The price would be ruinous. If he did nothing, he would implicitly accept everything the article claimed, except that he had hidden the return of you-know-who. What if you-know-who had indeed returned? Wouldn't that be the end of him? Fudge did not really believe you-know-who had come back, but what if? He could not bear the gamble. He sighed, moved from the window back to his desk, flipped the paper over, read the article again, and finally made his decision. No rebuttal. Far to the north, in a remote Scottish forest unknown to Muggles, a palatial house stood where once an abandoned cottage had rotted away. Cracks split the walls, the roof had holes, many panes were broken, and the door creaked on crooked hinges, yet someone had recently renovated the place in secret. The nearest village lay dozens of miles away, the nearest road over a dozen. Muggles wouldn't have noticed, even if they tried. Inside a dim room, Lord Voldemort flung a newspaper onto the hearth and set it alight in anger. His manpower was dwindling, and now he had lost 6 operatives at once. Useless! A pack of fools! They couldn't even bring back one Karkaroff, and they got themselves locked in Azkaban. The Death Eaters stood in 2 silent rows, heads bowed, barely daring to breathe. No one dared meet his eyes. Only the fireplace crackled, and Voldemort's fingers tapped the armrest. After a long, cold pause, he spoke. Avery. Avery, a tall, thin man in his 40s with graying hair and deep carved wrinkles, trembled when named. He stepped forward on unsteady legs, head bowed. Everything you assigned is proceeding as you ordered, my master. They will soon be at your disposal. Voldemort regarded him for a long moment. Then, with a hint of cautious approval, well done, Avery. What reward do you seek? Avery's shoulders relaxed an inch. He bowed deeper. To serve my master is my greatest reward. Lucius Malfoy, standing nearby, felt bewildered. What had Voldemort asked Avery to do? Why had Lucius not been informed? He remembered volunteering months ago when the Dark Lord had called for someone to handle a task. Lucius had stepped forward. Voldemort had looked at him, paused, and said only, "No need. No explanation. No reason." Lucius had assumed the assignment was unimportant, but now he wondered if the Dark Lord did not trust him. His fingers rubbed the inside of his robe pocket as he mulled whether he should send a message to Lynn for help. Voldemort's attention moved on. Alex. Alex, a younger Death Eater in his early 30s who stood a rank below Lucius, suddenly went rigid. He swallowed and finally managed, in a voice that trembled, "Master, the matter proved difficult. Our people met obstacles." Voldemort's eyes narrowed. So it was not accomplished. Alex knew there was no defense at this point. He dropped to his knees. "Yes, master, please punish me. Cruciatus." A crimson flash shot from Voldemort's wand. Alex's body arched. His mouth opened in a soundless scream as the pain racked him. His pupils shrank, the whites of his eyes bloodshot. The sight of him collapsed and shrieking in silence chilled Lucius to the bone. Cold sweat soaked his back. "Useless," Voldemort hissed. "Can't even handle such a small matter. What use are you?" He swept his gaze across the room and landed on Lucius. Lucius felt his heart seize. He forced himself forward, bowed, and said in a voice even more ingratiating than usual, "Master, give your orders." Voldemort studied him for a long moment. He had been inclined to entrust this matter to Lucius. But then he thought of Lucius's wealth, his walking wallet, and hesitated. "Never mind," he said finally, withdrawing his gaze. "I will handle it personally." Lucius's mind jammed. He opened his mouth to volunteer, but Voldemort's cold stare froze the words. He swallowed them down and murmured, "Yes, master." The brief meeting broke up. Before Lucius had even left the castle, he sent a message out. "Platinum gentlemen, the Dark Lord is about to act. Location unknown, target unknown. Take precautions." The reply came instantly. "Lynn. Oh, my dear business partner, has your head had a close encounter with a donkey's hoof? The message you just sent makes no sense." "I honestly don't know." "Fine, I'll be on the lookout. You keep yourself safe too. Ask for help if you run into danger." Chapter 336. Is it a giant? It was the weekend. The sun was dim and the wind dry. Heavy snow drifted past the window, the flakes tapping against the glass in a soft, steady patter. Inside the dormitory, Lynn was once again the only one left. Edgar and the others had gone to join the Dumbledore's army, organized by Harry Potter and his friends. He couldn't help a small laugh at the name. Dumbledore's Army, DA. It sounded absurdly militant for a study group. To anyone unfamiliar, it might even sound like a private militia training to attack the Ministry. Hermione, of course, had meant it differently, as a sign of support for Dumbledore, a way to say, even if the Ministry refused to admit you-know-who had returned and the Daily Prophet painted Dumbledore as senile, we stand with him. We are his army. Lynn remembered bumping into Dumbledore in the corridor the day the club started. The old headmaster had asked him, "Mr. Lynn, have you heard of a club called Dumbledore's Army?" He'd almost laughed out loud then, but had kept his composure. "Yes, Principal. It's a club for learning defense against the dark arts." Dumbledore merely nodded. "Oh, that's good," and walked on. Lynn had thought the headmaster didn't much care what students chose to call themselves. If Dumbledore didn't worry about the Minister for Magic, why worry about a club name? Putting those idle thoughts aside, Lynn got out of bed. He planned to go into the Forbidden Forest to collect supplies. His alchemy experiments had eaten through his stock. He needed ingredients. He hadn't been to see the Acromantula for some time. He wondered if they missed him. He dressed, threw a thick, traveling cloak over his shoulders, tucked his wand into his sleeve, and grabbed several empty bottles and cloth sacks from his drawer, stuffing them into his pockets. Then he left. The corridors were quiet. He walked through one hall after another, down several flights of stairs, across the entrance hall, and pushed open the castle's great doors. A cold gust hit his face. Snowflakes stung his cheeks. A few drifted into his collar and brushed his neck, making him flinch. He pulled his cloak up and his scarf higher and stepped into the storm. The path to the Forbidden Forest was already powdered with fresh snow. His boots squeaked as he walked. His footprints sank deep, but were quickly obscured by the falling flakes. As he neared the forest, a familiar smell reached him from off to one side, something rich and savory like stew. Hagrid back? He turned toward Hagrid's hut. Smoke now rose from its chimney in steady white puffs. Lynn paused at the familiar round wooden door and knocked 3 times. Thump, thump, thump. A dog barked inside, familiar, sharp. "Shut up, Fang," Hagrid's voice called, gruff and pleased. The door opened, and Hagrid's huge head filled the gap. "Lynn," he beamed, "how did you know I was back?" Lynn took a half-step back and rubbed his ears. "I smelled your stew." Hagrid blinked. "Of course," he said. "Come in. It's cold out." He widened the door. Lynn squeezed inside sideways. Hagrid was so broad he filled the frame, and Lynn had to be careful not to catch on the thick moleskin coat. "Fang, move," Hagrid muttered, nudging the dog aside with his boot as he shut the door. With a bang, the warmth of the hut slammed around Lynn, cutting off the winter air. The place smelled faintly of mildew and wood smoke, but Lynn hardly noticed. His eyes were on Hagrid. There were several patches of dried, dark red blood in Hagrid's hair, matting it into clumps. His right eye was slightly swollen. 2 teeth were missing. He looked as if he'd been badly beaten. "Hagrid, were you beaten up?" Lynn asked. Hagrid answered so quickly it sounded rehearsed. "No," he said, shaking his head with an exaggerated flourish. "No way. Who could beat me?" His eyes flicked away, a tell that made Lynn smile inwardly. "If your eyes weren't darting around while you said that, I might even believe you." The darting increased. It was a dragon. I went to Romania." "Romania," Lynn said, nodding. "A dragon that fights hand-to-hand? A new species?" Hagrid's eyes moved even faster. No, I remembered wrong. It was a sphinx." "A sphinx," Lynn repeated. "Sphinxes use claws and teeth." He glanced at the bruises on Hagrid's hand. "Those marks don't look like claw marks or bites. They look like they'd been made by a fist." "Then it was a troll. A troll couldn't beat you." Hagrid opened his mouth, then closed it. Lynn held up a finger. "Let me guess." His voice was level. "First, the one who hit you must have been massive and extremely powerful. Otherwise, they couldn't have bested you." He watched Hagrid's face. Good. The expression told him his deduction was on track. "Second, you've been away from Hogwarts for a long time, which means the place you went to isn't nearby." "A long distance, massive size, high combat power," Hagrid muttered. Lynn looked into his eyes and enunciated the last word like a verdict. "Giants." Hagrid's voice broke. "Is it that easy to guess?" He shook his head violently. No, no, what giants? I don't know anything about that. Hagrid, are you testing my knowledge of magical creatures? Lynn teased. Something clanged on the stove as Hagrid slammed a copper kettle down, one hand still on the handle, the other hanging limp. Lynn, he said, voice sudden and serious, I really can't say anything. It's classified. He turned his back to Lynn and stood by the stove, staring at the kettle as if it could answer for him. Lynn stared at Hagrid's broad back for a moment and then sighed. Dumbledore sent you, didn't he? Hagrid froze, but neither confirmed nor denied it. Lynn shrugged. Fine. Tea then. I just wanted to know which side the giants were on, but from the way you are, he let the sentence trail off. They stayed for a while. Hagrid fussed over a teapot and tried to keep the conversation light. When Lynn finally stepped back into the snow, the storm had strengthened. He adjusted his collar and continued toward the forbidden forest. He had walked fewer than 10 steps when a sudden burst of red light exploded before him. A phoenix flame flared, and Fawkes materialized, tilting his head and giving a clear, melodious cry. Well, Dumbledore has something for me again, Lynn murmured. Fawkes hopped closer and reached out a talon to grip his shoulder. The world spun in a dizzying whirl. Lynn blinked and found himself in Dumbledore's office. The phoenix's warmth was still on his shoulder, but it was Dumbledore's calm, lined face that met his. Between them floated a Dementor, its black cloak tattered and hollow. Lynn stared. Dumbledore has decided to change pets, he said wryly. If that's the case, Fawkes is mine. Fawkes pecked at him sharply in his arms. Dumbledore's voice was quiet. Aside from Azkaban, the Ministry does not normally permit Dementors to appear elsewhere, much less be kept here. Lynn looked from Fawkes to the dark figure. Then this is? Dumbledore's face was thoughtful. I caught it near Hogwarts. I brought it here to try to find out why it was there. Lynn frowned. Dementors and Hogwarts did not belong in the same sentence. Dementors were used to guard Azkaban, not to roam. Their appearance near the castle suggested only two possibilities. The Ministry had sent them, or something had gone very wrong at Azkaban. Why don't you just ask Fudge? Lynn suggested. Dumbledore shook his head. I suspect something has gone wrong at Azkaban, and the Ministry is hiding it. Remember the message Lucius sent you a while back? Lynn's brow tightened. He stepped toward the Dementor. It seemed wary of Fawkes and backed away, but the office walls hemmed it in. Lynn cradled the phoenix and walked closer. Why are you here? The Dementor hesitated, then gave a low, gurgling sound, almost like a word. Goo, goo. Hunger, the tone suggested. Can't get enough to eat. Lynn's eyes narrowed. Why are you hungry? The sound came again, clearer as if the Dementor struggled for language. Goo goo. Goo goo goo. Food, all gone. There was the answer. Azkaban's food supply was gone. Something had happened there. Dumbledore's expression hardened. Lynn felt the weight of it. If the prisons had been disrupted and the guards, if the Dementors were starving or missing, the consequences would ripple far beyond the island fortress. Lynn held Fawkes a moment longer, feeling the small, hot pulse of the phoenix beneath his fingers. Outside, snow still fell over Hogwarts, oblivious, for the moment, to troubles that might already be multiplying. Chapter 337, Respecting the Fate of Others. How many Dementors in total have left Azkaban? The Dementor was silent for a moment before answering with a rattling clack. 7 stacks. Lynn's mind whirred. 64 in a stack. This was burned into him from years of gaming. Every time he heard stack, he automatically thought of 64. Without thinking, he blurted, 448. Dumbledore froze. I don't recall Azkaban having that many Dementors. Only then did Lynn realize what he'd said. Well, he scratched his head. You misheard. It's 7 groups. Dumbledore eyed him skeptically, but didn't press. 7 groups, he repeated, letting out a small sigh of relief. That would be 140. Seeing Lynn still full of questions, Dumbledore explained, when Azkaban was first organized, it was divided into several sectors for prisoners of different degrees. Each sector is guarded by 20 Dementors. For the Ministry's convenience, that's the rule, 20 per group. Lynn nodded, filing away the new information. 140, he repeated, frowning. Still a lot. Dumbledore sighed. I'll be away for a while starting tomorrow. After a pause, he added, I'll be taking Fawkes with me. Lynn's eyes widened. Wait, you don't actually think I'm going to steal Fawkes, do you? Dumbledore looked embarrassed. No, of course not. Lynn waited for more. Dumbledore's voice returned to its usual unhurried cadence. If anything urgent comes up and you need to contact me, go to Professor McGonagall. She knows how to reach me. Just about the Dementors? Lynn asked. There are only 100 or so of them. It shouldn't take long, right? Dumbledore shook his head. It's not just because of the Dementors. In any case, stay at school and behave. Don't go anywhere. Don't worry. Lynn's answer was blunt. Dumbledore said nothing. The thought ran through his mind. The more he agrees, the more trouble he invites. But he knew Lynn well enough that saying it would be useless. He set down his teacup and stood. Fawkes hopped off Lynn and landed on Dumbledore's shoulder. In an instant, a burst of red flame glowed. Fawkes spread his wings, and the light wrapped Dumbledore, Fawkes, and that Dementor. Then they were gone. Lynn was alone in the office. Leaving the office, Lynn headed again toward the Forbidden Forest, muttering, I don't believe it. Is it really this hard to go collect a few materials today? Sometimes luck had its own plans. He had just reached the entrance to the Great Hall. Bang! The castle doors were flung open from outside. A crowd of students stormed in, a chaotic mass. Snow clung to their robes, their hair, even their eyelashes. One student had even lost a shoe, running in on one bare foot, apparently too panicked to notice the cold. Lynn reached out and stopped a sixth former rushing past. No, a third-year Gryffindor with freckles. The boy jumped as if startled and then relaxed slightly when he saw Lynn. What happened? Lynn asked. Dementors, the boy gasped. There are so many Dementors in the castle. Lynn frowned, about to go out and see for himself, when a shrill voice cracked across the entrance hall. Everyone be quiet. It was high and thin, drilling into Lynn's ears. He turned. Dolores Umbridge, in a sea of pink, was standing at the far end of the hall, wagging her wand at the students. It's just one Dementor, and look at you lot, behaving like lunatics. She clicked toward the castle gates in her high heels. Lynn let her pass without comment. For once he was content to respect others' fates, let them be. Umbridge reached the gates and planted herself there. A single Dementor drifted toward her from a distance. She sneered, loud and contemptuous. Pfft, a single Dementor, and you're all so frightened. She raised her wand, pointing its tip at the approaching creature. Who allowed you to come to Hogwarts? The Dementor paused, hood tilting, as if assessing this tiny, bold human. Umbridge's chin went up. She jabbed the wand twice in the air. I said, return to Azkaban immediately. This time the Dementor wasn't intimidated. It tilted its head and stared at Umbridge for 2 long seconds. Then it moved. It drifted toward her and opened its mouth, emitting that same long, rattling clack that had answered Dumbledore. To Umbridge it was meaningless, but Lynn heard it clearly. The words resolved in his mind. Come quickly. There's a massive pile of food here. Lynn moved silently to the castle door, grabbed the handle, and slammed it shut. The sound startled Umbridge. She took half a step back. Why are you closing the door? She squealed. Didn't you see the Dementor was? Her voice cut off. Dozens of Dementors were visible on the horizon, pouring in from the direction of the Forbidden Forest, the Black Lake, and the castle's wings, flying in from all sides. Umbridge's face went white. Open the door. Open it now. She tugged at the door again and again, but it didn't budge as if locked. Lynn stood calmly behind it, one hand in his pocket. Professor Umbridge, we're afraid of Dementors too. In the end, Umbridge did not perish at the hands of Dementors. It was a disappointment Lynn felt keenly. He half expected the castle to feel lighter without her constant tyranny. Just as Umbridge seemed about to be kissed, a silvery white beam of light shot out from a distance. The Dementors scattered as if burned. A voice called from outside, "Open the door! The Dementors have been driven away." It was Professor McGonagall. Lynn lifted the anti-Alohomora charm he'd placed on the door with a casual flick of his wand. The charm had been simple but effective. Umbridge had strained uselessly against it. The door swung open, and a gust of cold wind rushed in. Professor McGonagall strode through, carrying Umbridge across her shoulder like a sack. Umbridge was limp and pale, her lips purple. She looked like someone barely clinging to life. McGonagall herself radiated a low, commanding presence. When she saw Lynn, she blinked. "Mr. Lynn." "Professor, I'm afraid of Dementors," Lynn said plainly. McGonagall was momentarily speechless. Lynn, afraid of Dementors? The same boy who had chased Dementors around the train in 3rd year? the same one who had faced down a blue-ringed giant demon octopus in the Black Lake and dealt with champions under Imperius at the maze entrance? It was hard to reconcile. The expression on Lynn's innocent face made her wonder if she was losing her edge. How could someone who had done those things calmly admit fear of Dementors? Before she could respond, Lynn's voice rose with urgency. "Professor, Umbridge is about to expire. Take her to the infirmary." He pointed at Umbridge, slumped over McGonagall's shoulder. Her eyelids fluttered, her fingers twitched, her mouth moved in unintelligible sounds. Surrounded by dozens of Dementors, anyone would be badly affected. McGonagall shot Lynn a look that promised they'd settle the score later, then moved to carry Umbridge away toward the infirmary. Chapter 338, I Can't Disgust Myself Anymore. The Hufflepuff dormitory was warm and cozy. The fire in the hearth burned bright, orange light dancing on the walls. Outside the window, the snow had stopped, but a thin veil of water clung to the glass. Moonlight scattered through the droplets, refracting into a blurred halo that splayed over the dark wooden floor like frost. William sat at his desk, bent over this week's homework, brows knitted in concentration. His quill raced across the parchment. His handwriting was so tidy it looked printed. Edgar, working nearby, was less focused. His letters slanted, and he kept chatting with Lynn between sentences. "Lynn," Edgar called, idly spinning his quill. Lynn's voice came muffled from behind a heap of potion ingredients. "Lynn," Edgar tried again. No response. "Lynn," Edgar dragged the syllable out. "If you have something to say it. Don't just hum." Lynn's voice, muffled by jars and bundles, said, "If you pester me again, I'll throw you out." He was busy sorting ingredients collected from the Forbidden Forest. Acromantula venom into one vial, mooncalf dung into a bag, bowtruckle twigs wrapped in cloth and set aside, unicorn tail hair tied with a rubber band and hung on the corner of the table. His hands moved quick and sure. He knew where every specimen belonged, how to handle it, and how to store it without glancing twice. Edgar wasn't annoyed. He was used to Lynn's tone. He stopped his pen, turned, and said, "Umbridge is about to be transferred." That snapped everyone's attention to him. Silence settled over the dormitory. "Really?" Lynn asked. Edgar nodded and pointed a finger for emphasis. "Don't doubt my news. You'll see." The next day, a short notice appeared on the Hogwarts notice board, posted in the most conspicuous spot, in bold type, bearing the Ministry of Magic's red seal. It announced that Umbridge would no longer occupy her post at Hogwarts and was being transferred back to the Ministry for other duties. The message was brief, but the castle erupted. The news spread faster than wildfire. In less than half an hour, everyone on the grounds knew Umbridge was leaving. She proved efficient. Within hours, her office was half empty. Rumor said she'd started packing overnight. No one knew exactly why she was transferred, but that didn't dampen the celebration. Footsteps in the corridors grew lighter, laughter louder. The very air seemed fresher, as if some oppressive weight had been lifted from the castle. Breakfast in the great hall felt like a feast. Golden platters brimmed with food piled in small hills. Toast, crispy bacon, perfectly boiled eggs, steaming sausages, and pastries of names Lynn couldn't place. Jugs of pumpkin juice and pots of coffee were refilled again and again. Even the milk was changed multiple times. The house elves must have heard the news. They pulled out all their best dishes and specialties as if they wanted to pour a semester's worth of repressed enthusiasm into one morning. The professors were equally joyful. The atmosphere at the staff table was unlike its usual quiet murmur. Today, they laughed aloud, clinked glasses, and toasted. Professor Flitwick stood on his chair with his goblet raised, exchanging a cheerful remark with Professor Sprout, who laughed so hard she nearly spilled her wine. Minerva McGonagall kept her stern composure, but the slight lift at the corner of her mouth made it clear she was pleased. And Trelawney, always theatrical, sat on the edge of the staff table nearest Hufflepuff, a sherry glass before her. Sherry wasn't something Hogwarts served in the daily supplies. The kitchens might be able to produce anything, but alcohol wasn't part of the regular offerings. House elves could make butterbeer. The alcohol in it was barely noticeable, but proper sherry came from Hogsmeade, from the Three Broomsticks. A good bottle there cost 30 galleons. Not every wizard could afford it. Trelawney had already finished 2 bottles and was opening a third. Lynn did the quiet arithmetic in his head. Professors earned decently, not extravagantly. Still, today they poured out more than usual. Umbridge's departure had chased away the gloomy cloud that had hung over Hogwarts for weeks. The December weather in the Highlands, gray skies, biting wind, snow ready to fall, should have made everyone want to stay wrapped in blankets. Instead, even the bleakest branches and the coldest flakes felt less oppressive. When spirits lifted, everything else followed. Lynn leaned on the windowsill, watching the snow and thinking. Dumbledore had been away for a month now with no word, but there was news about Umbridge. The Daily Prophet had run a bold headline across its front page: Ministry of Magic Support successfully thwarts Death Eater plot. A photograph of Umbridge filled half the page. She stood on a street, wand raised, addressing the camera. She wore the black uniform of an Auror rather than her usual pink cardigan. The article was long and breathless. This morning, a dark arts incident occurred on a public street, causing casualties among several witches and wizards, it read. Senior Undersecretary to the Minister, Dolores Umbridge, led Auror efforts at the scene, successfully subduing and killing the Death Eater Anthony. It is reported Anthony was an especially cruel Death Eater, likely intending to make a dramatic return. Senior Undersecretary Umbridge said, "We received the report too late. Had we arrived sooner, there may have been fewer casualties." She urged everyone to remain vigilant, saying this is a special time and only by working together can we win the coming war. William set the paper down with a soft smack. She actually went after a Death Eater? Who knows? Lynn shrugged, uneasy. He remembered Umbridge during her stint at Hogwarts. She'd never displayed much magical skill. She read from textbooks in class, graded, wrote notes, but she never demonstrated wand work that required technical finesse. At times, Lynn had suspected she couldn't use a wand effectively at all. Yet the prophet claimed she had subdued and killed a dangerous Death Eater. A mediocre wizard confronting an extremely cruel Death Eater and prevailing? It sounded like someone had helped her. Lynn's unease grew. There was a small grain of detail nagging at him. The contract he'd made Umbridge sign, the unbreakable vow. It wasn't a joke. The penalty for breaking it was death. And yet, Umbridge was alive, now outside the school, and no longer under his immediate control. Some clauses in that contract could no longer be enforced. What had gone wrong? He considered that he hadn't properly tested the contract parchment at the time. Maybe there were minor flaws. Otherwise, there was no plausible explanation for why she hadn't died. He forced himself to stop chasing the thought. Alive was fine. At least she wasn't at Hogwarts anymore. She couldn't disgust him here any longer. Chapter 339, Lynn's fishing rod breaks. It's insane. The whole of Hogwarts has gone mad. When Edgar's voice exploded through the Hufflepuff dormitory, the sky outside the window had not yet fully brightened. Gray light leaked through the gaps in the curtains, falling across the floor like a thin ribbon from the door to the sill. Edgar stood by his bed, clutching a sock, his face a mix of anger and despair. He muttered as he pulled on his clothes, sounding put upon, as if to say, "Is the whole world picking on me? We have to get up an hour earlier now, just to have a chance at a seat in the library." He yanked the sock over his right foot. "I've never had to wake up this early before." The reason was simple. As days slipped by, the OWLs and NWTs were drawing closer. To Hogwarts students, those two exams were more terrifying than the name Lord Voldemort. At least Dumbledore could stand against Voldemort. No one could sit your exams for you. Less than 6 months remained. 6 months sounded long, but once you subtracted Christmas and Easter holidays, Quidditch days, and the days you were sick, tired, or simply unwilling to study, the time left could be counted on your fingers. There were assignments, essays, and required practicals. The Hogwarts library became the place everyone wanted to be. By 8 every morning, it was jammed. So students started getting up earlier and earlier. 7 yesterday, 6:30 today, 6 tomorrow, maybe 5 the next day. Some 5th and 7th years even waited at the library entrance at 3 in the morning. Edgar scratched his head, frustrated. He looked at Lynn, his expression shifting from annoyance to puzzlement. "Why aren't you dressed yet?" "Forget it. I'm not waiting for you." Edgar turned away, shouldered his bag. "Need me to save you a seat?" "If there's any space left at all in the library." Lynn yawned. stretched one hand out from under the quilt, and waved it in Edgar's direction. No need. You guys go on. It's just an exam. It won't stop me getting a job. Edgar. Damn it. Even though my dad's a department head, he still looks at my grades to decide if I'll be allowed into the ministry. He tightened the strap on his bag. Maybe I won't go into the ministry after all. It'd be nicer to just hang out with you lot. Lynn considered for a moment. In that case, your parents would probably try to have me killed. Edgar's face froze at the image. All right, I'm going. After Edgar and the others left, the dormitory grew quiet again. Lynn went back to sleep for a while, then made his way down to the common room and froze. Good morning, Professor. Professor Sprout stood in the center of the common room in her work clothes, holding a folded notice and wearing thick dragon-hide gloves stained with soil and clippings. She had clearly just come from the greenhouses. When she saw Lynn, her smile grew wider. Good morning, Mr. Lynn. You've come just in time. I have something to tell you and Mr. Diggory. Professor, looking for me? Cedric's voice came from behind Lynn, and he stepped up beside them. Oh, Mr. Diggory's here too. I must be lucky. Professor Sprout put away her smile and handed the folded notice to the two of them. Lynn unfolded it. Ministry of Magic Internship Recruitment Notice. Lynn raised an eyebrow. Internship? Ministry? Recruitment? The words had little appeal when strung together. He scanned the notice as she read aloud. Due to force majeure, the Ministry of Magic was short-staffed and was issuing this notice to outstanding Hogwarts students. If you intended to work at the ministry after graduation, this internship would be an excellent stepping stone. Students could study in depth within various departments during the internship. Because students still needed to complete their studies, working hours were limited to weekends. Salary would match the daily wage of regular ministry employees. Lynn's eyes dropped to the recruits line. Number of recruits, 8. Only 8. If they're so desperate, why hire only 8 people? Then the requirements. 1. Age 14 or older. 2. Grades fewer than 2 failed subjects in previous years. 3. Magical competence must be up to standard. Practical spells mastered would be prioritized. When Lynn read fewer than 2 failed subjects, a small smile tugged at his mouth. He searched his memory and couldn't recall ever failing anything. Not out of arrogance, he simply hadn't. His report cards were full of O's, with the occasional E when Snape was especially annoyed, but never a P or D. For him, that requirement was meaningless. A note at the end read, during this special period, the ministry would work closely with Hogwarts and welcome every outstanding student interested in the position. Even if you did not meet all the requirements, the ministry would still give your application serious consideration. Lynn clicked his tongue. Even if you don't meet all the requirements, we'll still consider you, basically meant, come on in if you're cheeky enough, but don't expect us to accept you. He and Cedric folded the notice and handed it back. Think it over, Professor Sprout said, tucking it away. It's a good opportunity. Cedric answered immediately. I'm willing to go, Professor. I've always wanted to work at the ministry. Professor Sprout beamed. She looked at Lynn. He hesitated. Professor, can I choose which department? If you meet the requirements, she said, then recalled Lynn's record and smiled. You do. Yes, you can. Lynn's face lit up. Great. I want the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement, arguably the most powerful department in the ministry. It housed the Auror Office, the Magical Law Enforcement Squad, the Wizengamot Administration Services, and more. Each office wielded real influence and access to the core mechanisms of the wizarding world. Not everyone could get into any of them. Professor Sprout wasn't surprised by Lynn's choice. She likely expected it. It was the department with the most power and the most relevance to his aims. But Lynn's reason wasn't prestige. The thinking was simple. He couldn't kill Voldemort quickly, so he'd start by taking on Voldemort's followers. Voldemort himself was hidden and elusive. Death Eaters, however, were active and easier to find, easier to catch and easier to deal with. Catch one Death Eater, and it was like cutting off a hand. Catch 10, like cutting off both hands. Catch 100, and he'd be much diminished. Someone might ask, why not just hunt them on your own? Go when you wanted, catch when you wanted, kill when you wanted, no rules, no procedure. That would be freer, simpler, more satisfying. Lynn's answer, It's better to do it legally. No need for secrecy. No need to erase witness memories after every operation. Put on an Auror uniform, wear an Auror badge, and you can hunt Death Eaters in broad daylight. Huh? There were things even Aurors couldn't do, but would the Ministry pursue you if a Death Eater dropped dead during an operation? Probably not. You'd be performing official duties, protecting the wizarding world. That's the difference between legal and illegal. Then I'll submit both your names to Professor McGonagall, Professor Sprout said, and you can wait for notification for the interview. The two nodded and watched her go. In the following days, Lynn didn't wait for the Ministry's interview notice so much as a call from Dumbledore. "Hello, Principal. How do you have time to call me? Been having a good time out there?" Lynn's voice on the other end was sarcastic. Dumbledore was silent for a moment, then took a breath. "Mr. Lynn, do you remember what we discussed before I left the school?" Lynn thought, then shrugged. "What was that, Principal? Give me a hint." Dumbledore's tired voice answered, "You promised me you wouldn't leave Hogwarts." Lynn, how could he have forgotten? He scrambled for an explanation. "Principal, I haven't left Hogwarts." "What about this internship application?" Dumbledore began. Lynn cut him off. "Principal, I just want to help share the burdens of the wizarding world." Dumbledore. He knew Lynn too well. Whenever Lynn started acting high-minded, Dumbledore could see the real motive, a legal route to vengeance on the Death Eaters. Lynn fumbled on. Looking at your face, Principal, you look so tired I couldn't help." Beep. The line went dead. Lynn thought Dumbledore must have been moved by his noble motives. In reality, Dumbledore was simply exasperated and afraid he might not be able to stop himself from returning to Hogwarts to give Lynn a very stern talking to. Chapter 340, Saturday, 8:30 a.m. A small group had gathered in the entrance hall of Hogwarts. Lynn stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets, expression calm. He was dressed casually for school, robes, the standard tie, and his usual dragonhide boots. Cedric stood beside him, clutching a folder of documents marked 18he. Cedric looked much more serious than Lynn. His tie was perfectly knotted, robes neatly pressed, shoes polished, hair combed. He might as well have stepped off the cover of a careers pamphlet. Other students were scattered around the hall. 2 Slytherins lingered by the wall, keeping to themselves as if drawing a deliberate line. 4 Ravenclaws stood together, whispering. For some reason, there were no Gryffindors at all. Lynn scanned the room to make sure he hadn't missed anyone and decided comfortingly that perhaps they preferred their freedom. It wasn't that they hadn't been selected, just that they had chosen not to come. "Very good. No one is late," Professor McGonagall announced from the far end of the hall. She looked over the students, nodded in satisfaction, then turned toward the largest fireplace, the one wide enough to hold several people at once. Above the hearth, someone had carved the Hogwarts motto, "Never tickle a sleeping dragon." McGonagall bent to scoop a handful of flue powder from a table by the fire. The powder hissed into the flames and emerald green fire leapt up. "Ministry of Magic," she said. She beckoned them forward, and the students stepped into the fireplace one by one, swallowed by the green flames. Lynn was the last to enter. He paused to glance at the still-burning hearth and then stepped inside. Whoosh! They arrived at the Ministry via Floo and found Cornelius Fudge waiting near the fireplace. "Welcome, welcome," he said, striding up to them and offering his hand to McGonagall. His smile was the practiced public one, sweeping over the young faces. "Minister, I didn't expect you to be here," McGonagall said with a hint of surprise. The 2 Slytherins looked dazzled. "These are the future hope of the Ministry," Fudge boomed. "Of course I had to come in person." His gaze lingered on Lynn for a fraction longer than on the others. "Come along now," he said, turning toward the lifts. "I'm sure you're eager." He led them toward the lifts, talking as they walked and pointing out things along the way. "That's the registration desk," he said, indicating a counter where a clerk in a ministry uniform sat with his head down, writing. "Every wizard who comes here must register their 32, note the time of their visit, and collect a visitor's badge. Of course," he turned and smiled at the students, "you lot don't have to." Lynn scratched his head. He'd been here plenty of times without registering. Fudge pointed to the golden fountain at the center of the hall. "The Fountain of Magical Brethren. A portion of the coins thrown in is donated to St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries. Every 25, Newt and Galleon becomes bandages, bedding, instruments, useful things for the healers. So, his tone grew solemn. If you have the chance to work at the ministry someday, remember to bring spare change. Lynn peered into the fountain. The water was so clear he could see the coins piling up on the bottom. Galleons, 25, nuts, a thick layer of metal. He did the math and decided it was probably barely enough for a crate of bandages. It wasn't stinginess so much as an observation. The ministry didn't look especially generous. Fudge continued, pointing out floors as they passed the lift bank. Level 6, Department of Magical Transportation. Level 7, Department of Magical Games and Sports. Level 4, Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Level 2, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Each time he named a department, a student would glance up with interest. Cedric's fingers tightened on his folder when Fudge said, Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Lynn remembered that Cedric's father, Amos Diggory, worked in that department. Along the corridor, ministry staff and visitors passed by. Each time someone recognized Fudge, they stopped to bow slightly. Good morning, Minister, they offered, or hello, Minister. Fudge answered every greeting with the same practiced ease. Good morning. You're looking well. I read that report. Very well done. Lynn watched the practiced performance and thought, politician. Whatever's going on inside, the face stays reassuring. After they stepped into the lift, Fudge's voice softened. I rarely come to the office proper, he admitted. There are so many people here. I'm always detained. If I could, I'd rather be working. Lynn thought, once you're out of office, we'll see how much attention you get. The lift stopped repeatedly and students alighted, the gilded grills sliding up and down, each door opening onto a different corridor. Level 4, Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. A mechanical female voice intoned. Cedric stepped out, turned, and waved. See you tonight, he called. See you tonight, Lynn replied. By the time the lift reached Level 2, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, only Lynn and a Slytherin remained. The two climbed out, surprised when Fudge followed them. Aren't you supposed to be at work, Minister? Lynn asked bluntly. Fudge blinked, a little thrown by the blunt dismissal, and quickly recovered. Since I'm here, I might as well inspect how the Department of Magical Law Enforcement is faring. That's part of the minister's responsibilities. He strode ahead and stopped before a door marked Reception Room. Without knocking, he pushed the door open and walked in. Inside sat Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and Rufus Scrimger, head of the Auror Office, both waiting to interview interns. They were startled by Fudge's sudden entrance. Minister? Amelia's voice was steady, but her eyes registered the intrusion. Inspecting. Anything wrong? Amelia and Scrimger exchanged a glance. If you were inspecting work, you didn't loiter in the reception room instead of your office. Still, the formalities had to be observed. The interview process itself was surprisingly concise, for Lynn at least. He sat on the wooden chair in the center of the room. It was hard-backed and uncomfortable. He straightened, placed his hands on his knees, and looked at the two interviewers across from him. Amelia sat to the left, Scrimger to the right. His file, several sheets of 18 filled with writing, lay between them. Amelia tapped the papers once, twice, 3 times. Mr. Lynn, she began, which department are you applying to join? The Auror Office, Lynn replied plainly. Scrimger's body shifted forward. His fingers drummed on the table, eagerness obvious. The Auror Office was desperately understaffed. Many had retired or resigned, some were injured, some had died. Training took years, the pass rate was low, and attrition was high. In 3 years, only one recruit, Tonks, had completed the program. Auror selection required top-tier spellcasting, fitness, mental resilience, reaction speed, judgment, stress tolerance. Most candidates failed at the first hurdle. So when someone with true potential said he wanted to be an Auror, Scrimger's excitement was palpable. Still, procedure must be followed. Tell me why you want to join the Auror Office. Because I want to catch Death Eaters, Lynn said. Because I want them to pay. Because I don't want anyone else to die because of them. Silence hung in the reception room for a few seconds. Then Amelia smiled slightly. Welcome to the Auror Office. The Slytherin who'd come with them had applied for a different department, one that didn't require frontline fighting. But under Amelia and Scrimgeour's scrutiny, the interviews were relentless. Amelia's questions came in quick succession, precise and designed to expose weaknesses. You're undercover at a dark wizard gathering and must use the Cruciatus curse to avoid blowing your cover. What do you do? The Slytherin went pale. He glanced between Amelia and Scrimgeour as if seeking a lifeline. His voice was barely audible. I would use it, he added, as if to justify himself, but I'd control the intensity so the other person wouldn't be hurt too badly. Scrimgeour frowned. Amelia didn't comment aloud. She made a brief note on the ean and moved on. You hear cries for help inside a private residence and smell a restricted potion, but you have no search warrant. Do you break in illegally? This time the Slytherin answered faster. Yes, a human life could be at stake. The rules can be flexible. Amelia wrote again. Modifying the memory of a terminally ill muggle will hasten their death, but not doing so would violate the statute of secrecy. Which do you choose? When the Slytherin finally left the room, he looked drained, white-faced, trembling lips, even his fingers ghostly. He seriously suspected his parents had raised him to resent these two interviewers. Otherwise, how could anyone's questions be so merciless?